Biohazard.
Hello, everyone. It's Andy and Matt the Marvel here from Biohazard Declassified. I trust you're all doing well. Got a very, very special guest here. Introduce yourself, my friend. How are you?
Good morning, everyone. This is Alex. I'm known as CVX Freak on social media. Good morning.
Very, very grateful to have you on today, Alex. We're going to be diving in with the CVX Freak. We're going to be going into all kinds of details, but most importantly, what have you got coming out? Run us through it.
Oh, you're talking about my book, right?
I am indeed.
Yeah, actually, as maybe you haven't heard, but I did finish writing a Resident Evil book at the end of last year, and it was funded on the UK publisher site, Unbounded. So it's done a lot better than I thought it would, thankfully. We're at, what is it now? 143% funding, which is way over the goal, obviously, and 850 supporters so far. So thank you all very much. The book is about the development of the Resident Evil series in the first 10 to 12 years of the series' lifespan. And I interviewed almost every creator from the era about their experiences and their intentions and motives for developing the Resident Evil games at that time. And they had a lot of interesting things to say. So I'm glad that in due time, the book will eventually come out and people will be allowed to dive into those developer anecdotes. So I'm really excited. The other day, I just finished reading a legal draft of the book, and it's been cleared for the most part. So we should be well on our way to publication in April of next year. Oh, awesome. So, yeah, so a little bit of time left to go, but
yeah. So you said 12 years. So this puts us from the original that came out in 1996. That will put us all between 1996 and 2008. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe up until 2006, because the first game began development in 1993, 1994. So it took about 2 years before the first game would come out. So it includes, I guess, those 1 to 2 years before the first game came out. So yeah, I say 10 to 12 just because in their heads they think it's 10 years, but in reality it's 12 years. So
this is a very unique concept, actually, because we're often seeing like the SD Perry novels, the mangas, the comics of Resident Evil, but to have a non-fiction book about the Resident Evil development, I think is really fascinating. So give us your thoughts on why specifically this style of book, why Itchy Tasty, and why are you going into the developmental history?
Well, so I work in the game industry, and I've been in it for about 10 years now, and I do a lot of business development. So personally speaking, I'm very interested in how video games are created from a production standpoint. So, for the average person, a game just gets developed and it comes out. But the reality is these are multi-year endeavors, and they take a lot of time and planning, and things change throughout development, and creators might have different intentions than what fans can perceive. So I thought it would be very interesting for me to talk to the developers of the Resident Evil series throughout its history and kind of get a sense of what they were doing. Were they just doing their jobs and making a game so they can take home a paycheck every day, or did they have other intentions in terms of their creative output? Or if you're on the business side, what were your motivations for trying to sell a game in a specific way? I'd like to preface for those who don't know, but I actually do live in Japan. I'm originally from San Francisco, but I moved here about 12 years ago, and I am fluent in Japanese. So
brilliant.
I feel like I'm in a unique position to talk to these developers directly in their native language. So I can talk to them in a way where things won't either get lost in translation, or they won't be filtered eventually when they make it onto the Western media in a more typical interview. So The other thing is I do have good relationships with almost every developer of Resident Evil from the very beginning, and I did talk to a lot of the directors of the first 4 Resident Evil games. So
Oof.
it was a fun experience, yeah, and a lot of it is thanks to the fact that I do work in the industry, and I did have relationships with these people through my main job, but I also managed to form personal relationships with them, and a few years later, the end result is the book that I wrote. So I hope people enjoy it.
Yeah. And as I said, it's as you rightly put, you're in a very, very unique position. Going back to so we're at 1993, 1994. We're looking at a little bit of gameplay here on Resident Evil 1. As much as you can, or as little as you can, talk us through the original development process of the first Resident Evil, or Biohazard, of course, as it's known in Japan, to the best of your knowledge.
Sure. Yeah, it looks a little different here than what we're used to, I think. But as the story goes, in the 80s, Capcom released a game for the Famicom called Sweet Home, and that was based on a Japanese horror movie. Very niche. It wasn't terribly famous or successful. But the person who spearheaded that game, his name was Tokuro Fujiwara, and he was basically Capcom's senior producer or executive producer on the console side of development. Console and arcade being the 2 big divisions of Capcom at the time. And although Sweet Home wasn't terribly successful compared to other games like Mega Man, for example, the Fujiwara really wanted to continue the idea of making horror games into their own genre. And so he spent a few years trying to figure out how to make horror games into a thing, but unfortunately the hardware at the time just wasn't capable enough to bring to life a credible form of horror gaming. So things changed in 1993, and by Fujiwara's own his own memory or his own admission, the first time he felt that it would have been possible to bring back survival horror as a concept was when he saw 2 games, Star Fox on the Super Nintendo with the
Star Fox.
Yeah, it was called Mode 7, right?
Something like that.
Oh, the Mode 7
polygon.
chip. Yeah, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, gotcha.
He saw Star Fox running on the Super Famicom and with polygons, and he also saw Virtua Fighter in the arcade. So when he saw those 2 games, he realized that this could be their chance to finally, do what Sweet Home couldn't do and make an actual credible survival horror game. So this was around late 1993, I think. And so at this point, Fujiwara was no longer creating games himself. He was just a producer. So he sought out a younger person at Capcom who could direct the project from a creative standpoint. And he decided to choose Shinji Mikami, whom we all know, because Mikami had demonstrated that he was a very capable planner, especially for the Aladdin game that he made on the Super NES. So Mikami was put in charge of the...
No, I was just saying, which has garnered a great cult following, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Mikami has always been a very talented creator and he has a very sharp mind, I think, in terms of being able to perceive, how people react to things. So, yeah, Mikami had never directed a game before, I don't think, but he accepted the project, and the team was pretty small, and there were a lot of challenges with regards to the game's development that they had never faced before. For example, I think most people should know that the original Resident Evil was originally intended to be a first-person shooter.
I was just about to mention that. Yeah, go on.
The hardware, the hardware wasn't capable of that, so they ended up adopting the pre-rendered backgrounds that we are very familiar with today. So that would probably be the way I would describe the birth of Resident Evil, from Sweet Home until it was eventually greenlit. I don't think a lot of people know about the fact that Star Fox and Virtua Fighter were the 2 games that kind of served as the impetus for the producer to greenlight the project because
That
it's
blows
really,
my
yeah,
mind.
exactly, yeah. The producer in a Japanese game company, a producer is a lot like a project manager, but they also have a lot of sway in getting things greenlit. So some people have this image that the director is at the top of the project, which can be true, especially in a lot of Western game development projects. But in Japan, a lot of the power does rest in the hands of the producer. So
Really?
yeah,
Just
very
picking up
interesting stuff.
just picking up on your point about it being a first person shooter, because I think that's a very, very I think mind blowing aspect that even, and it's weird looking at it now because Resident Evil now is, all in with first person with Resident Evil 7,
yeah.
Resident Evil 8. So to your knowledge, how far did they get with the first person concept before they went, oh, do you know what? We need to do what I now regard as a typical Capcom thing of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and starting again. I mean, where did they actually get to? Was it literally just pre-production and then they said, right, hardware can't cope, let's write out? Or did they at least get to like early programming?
That would be my understanding. They assembled the production team, which was, I guess at the very beginning, it would have been 10 or so people. I have to go back and check the actual numbers, but
Sure.
I mean, a lot of the first steps of game development in Japan are people sitting in a room and talking all day and making rough sketches of all the different concepts and drafting up the ideas. I believe they tried to code very early on, like a Resident Evil game in first person, but I think they understood the limitations of the hardware very early on. And
So it was like very rough.
Yeah, I believe there were some first-person shooter games on PC already at the time, but they were all pretty much Western-developed games. So Japanese game development wasn't terribly familiar with the creation of the first-person shooter. So I think they didn't get very far before they adopted the third-person viewpoint instead.
Now, do you know, like, if Sweet Home was like the isometric view was kind of like maybe a precursor to like the fixed camera angles that we have now, or that we did have?
I would imagine a little bit, but I do know that Fujiwara didn't. I mean, he wanted to remake Sweet Home, right? That was the high level concept, or the low level concept rather. Like, he wanted to bring Sweet Home back, but he also realized that Sweet Home was not successful due to a variety of factors. And part of that is the fact that the isometric viewpoint was not considered to be very scary by most people who played the game. So they wanted to change things up a bit in order to not repeat the same mistakes that they made with Sweet Home.
So on that point of so we spoke about the pre-production of Resident Evil 1, moving into more of the live action, because I found that really quite fascinating about the first Resident Evil was the live action stuff, and I'll splice it in just a second. But have you got any backstory to that? Why they didn't just go fully I mean, obviously it would have been quite early CGI, I mean in 1996, but why did they go for the live action and not just text or something like that?
I think it was obviously a very low budget affair. Like the shooting of the live action scenes, they hired random American or Western actors who happened to be living in Japan and who were willing to work for, I guess that was a week that they shot that video, maybe a little less.
That took a week?
I would probably, yeah. I think, people on the development team have very different memories of how long it took, but it was about a week, I think. And yeah, it was just very basic and very basic shooting, very basic editing. I think CG as a mainstream element of PlayStation games was still a bit far off, maybe another 2 years away. So this was the most feasible way they can include like actual people or people-like depictions in the game.
Sure.
I think they really wanted Resident Evil to come off as very realistic and more immersive than any of the other games that Capcom had made up until that point. And as far as Japanese games were concerned, something like this was extremely unusual at the time. So it made that a bit of a novelty, and especially being the first thing that people see when they start the game up, I think it was very successful in making a name for the franchise early on.
Did the developers at the time, and again, you can only foresee so much, but did they realize what they were working with was very state of the art, and that they knew the second it released, it was going to garner a ridiculous following?
I don't get the impression that they had grandiose ambitions at the time of development. I do think that they realized they were making something unique, which was fine in and of itself, but that's not such an unusual viewpoint to have for a Japanese developer when they make a game. Capcom as a company had very low expectations for the game, actually, in terms of its potential commercial performance. I think Capcom expected the game maybe to sell 50 to 60,000 copies, which wasn't really a lot at that time. Fujiwara, on the other hand, was very confident in the game's success. So
really,
he had his own. He felt it would be more successful than the people at Capcom were giving it credit for. Now, here's an interesting anecdote. I do know that Mikami has talked about this in some detail with Polygon a few years ago, but Resident Evil was actually almost canceled.
Wow.
Whoa.
Please indulge.
Well, basically, if we look back at Capcom's history, they made a bunch of NES Famicom games, and then they made Street Fighter 2 for the arcade and for consoles. And Street Fighter 2 was a very successful game, but the thing is, by the mid 90s, 1995-ish, the Street Fighter 2 boom had kind of run its course, and Capcom had been unable to come up with a successor title that can repeat Street Fighter 2's popularity. So the company was also like not as big as it was today. So it was very much a business that can go under if the wrong decisions were made. This was in the mid 90s. But yeah, I think the management at Capcom at the time had asked one of the big consulting firms in the US to evaluate the business. And that consulting firm apparently recommended that the Resident Evil project be canceled due to the unlikelihood of it being successful. And apparently Capcom's management was very close to listening to that or heeding that consulting company's advice, but Fujiwara intervened at the end and pushed the game out before Capcom could cancel it.
That is an unreal anecdote.
Yeah, it's surprising to hear that Resident Evil could have just not ever come out, right? And I think that would have changed gaming history. But the game did come out, and it was far more successful than even Fujiwara, who thought it would be successful, did not realize it would be that successful. It was one of the first, if not the first, PlayStation game to sell over 1 million units globally, and yeah, that pretty much spearheaded Capcom's history in the second half of the 90s. So it was almost not a thing, and it's kind of sad to hear that. But I'm glad that Fujiwara told the consulting company to shove it, because these are those consulting companies that you pay thousands of dollars an hour for, just to get advice on how to run your business. But if they make bad decisions like that.
No, agreed, and thank you for sharing that. That's knowledge that I wasn't aware of.
That kind of gives you like that. Oh, I almost died feeling like I almost didn't make it.
Yeah,
and that's something I wanted to touch on as well. Obviously, Biohazard being a Japanese produced game, what were they like when? I don't want to say so. How did they feel when they sent it to international markets? Did they realize the absolute magnitude of how successful it was in foreign regions like the UK, for example, and the US? I mean, what was their approach to that? Did they think, right, we know this is going to be successful domestically, or did they go, right, well, actually, we really want to market this towards international territories?
Yeah, interestingly enough, Resident Evil's initial success primarily came from Japan. And I do think time lag does kind of factor into that, because unlike today, we don't have like continuous streams of information from whatever country you wanna look into. But Japan was definitely the first country where Resident Evil was truly big, and North America followed not too long after. But yeah, I think the intention for the original Resident Evil wasn't necessarily to cater to Western markets. That was still a very bizarre or unheard of concept in Japanese game dev back then. A lot of the focus did come on the home market, because I think back in the day, I think Japan was still the second largest. I mean, it still is today, but I think Japan was one of the largest video game markets at the time. I think a lot of Japan and the US, and I guess North America, including Canada. But I think Europe, which was already big, but not as big as it is today. So Japan and the US were definitely the priorities for Capcom. And I think that's reflected in the fact that Resident Evil only came out a week later in North America. So I think they wanted Westerners to like the game, but I don't know if that was specifically like a requirement for the game to be greenlit, right?
Oh,
that makes sense.
So their main aim in your eyes was always that they wanted it to be successful domestically, pretty much at all costs, and then we'll worry about international territories later down the line.
Kind of. They weren't sure how Resident Evil would perform in any country it was released in. It could have been successful in Japan, but not anywhere else, right? Or it could have been successful overseas, but not in Japan, right? Things like that are definitely very possible.
Isn't that why we get a lot of Japan exclusive titles now? Is because, oh, hey, this isn't going to do well overseas, so let's just keep it here. And I'm sure that was the case for Resident Evil at one point.
Actually, I mean, the way they spoke to me was always planned as an international thing. It wasn't ever going to be released only in one region, but they just weren't sure how the market as a whole would react to it. So they were lucky with Street Fighter 2. That was the definition of a global phenomenon. Like no matter what continent you were on, people knew about Street Fighter 2, and they definitely enjoyed it. Mega Man, on the other hand, was a lot less successful in Japan than it was in other regions. So Capcom had experienced both kinds of cases. And I think as the third case where a game is successful in Japan but not anywhere else, I think Breath of Fire was that one series for Capcom. I think that was the one that was big in Japan but not really big in the West. So they weren't really sure. And obviously, Sweet Home aside, Resident Evil was very different from anything that they'd released before. It was also a PlayStation game, and that was still a very new market at the time. Like in 1996, people still weren't sure whether the PlayStation would be around for the long haul. I think the Saturn was performing just as well, or if not better at the time. And I think Nintendo was coming to market within a few months. So there was a lot of uncertainty with video games in general at the time. So it was very hard for anybody at Capcom to really predict just how things would play out.
And that's a fantastic point. That's just like, poof, like when you really think about it, because this is 1995, 1996. you forget the bigger picture, what was going on. Sony, you know, this was Sony's first big, you know, they had the Nintendo PlayStation concept, which didn't end up going ahead. And, and this is, I mean, when did the PlayStation come? Was it 1995 or 1994?
It was December 94 here, but the following year, I think like in September.
Okay.
Yeah, like in September or so in North America. I don't remember the European release date, unfortunately, but it's kind of unreal to think that there were 9-month gaps between console releases.
Well, think of it, and this puts all of your points here into, and all of your anecdotes into one massive cycle here, because Capcom had bought in consultants like to manage their business. They already had the uncertainty of the PlayStation, which was very recent, and they were trying out a new IP that they were sinking money into. There are just so many uncertainties here, which you would not be surprised if one of these fell down.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of it just comes down to luck, right, or chance, right? And they chose the PlayStation because that was the more so than the Saturn. That was a very 3D focused game hardware, and it was a lot easier to develop for PlayStation than it was for Saturn. But as we look at other developers around the world, I think Tomb Raider was a Saturn game first, right? So there were companies who prioritized that system instead of the PlayStation. So if the Saturn had been a huge hit and the PlayStation not, then you know, history could have changed like in that regard as well, particularly with Resident Evil 2. But yeah, I mean, it seems so easy and deliberate, you know, for looking at it from the outside, but there was a lot of uncertainty with regards to production of video games at the time, regardless of Capcom's financial health, right? That being another thing.
Agreed.
So.
And something I've completely forgot to address, kind of a little bit of an elephant in the room, actually. We're talking about early Resident Evil. Resident Evil, what was Capcom really affected because they couldn't use the Biohazard name in overseas territories? I completely forgot not to cover that. Because, you know, it was Biohazard in Japan. I'm imagining some sort of, they were held up with some sort of copyright in the US. So they couldn't use Biohazard title. Have you got any sort of thoughts or anecdotes around that?
Yeah, I think Biohazard was definitely supposed to be the name in the West, but I think the trademark was held by a band. Right. So Capcom would have to pay royalties to that band in order to use the name Biohazard. And I don't know how to say this without sounding very harsh, but Capcom is very conservative with how they spend money and how they budget things, to say nicely. So Capcom as a company doesn't like to spend money when they don't have to. And they realized that maybe changing the name would be a lot more financially cost effective, right? Because they didn't know if the game would be successful. So they didn't want to potentially find themselves in a situation where they were paying royalties, you know, endlessly.
Agreed.
On a video game that very much does not depend on the success of that IP holder, right? Another uncertainty. Yeah,
Jesus.
Exactly. So they changed the name, and you know there is precedent for this. Like most of Capcom's NES games have different names in Japan versus the West. So there's Mega Man and there's Rockman. I think one of the Bionic Commando games, I think the NES version of Bionic Commando is called Hitler's Revenge in Japanese, right? So
what?
They've been
I didn't know that.
Revenge or Hitler Strikes Back. If you played the game, you'll notice that there are a lot of Nazi-like characters.
Yeah, I just didn't know.
So they changed the title for that. Street Fighter was the same, but you know all the subtitles were different depending on which territory you were talking about. So it's not like having a different name was something that was unfamiliar to Capcom as a company. So I would argue they were familiar with that kind of issue to deal with. So I don't think changing the name to Resident Evil was really anything more than just making sure they didn't step on anyone's toes.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm happy that didn't cause a massive fuss. And obviously, Resident Evil as a brand is really strong, and so is Biohazard. So credit to them for both maintaining it. We spoke about Resident Evil 1. We're gonna start to move closer to Biohazard 2, Resident Evil 2, and we've got some gameplay of Resident Evil 1.5 here. What are your thoughts about Resident Evil 1.5, and what was the if you have any anecdotes, what are your anecdotes behind Resident Evil 1.5, the development process and whatnot?
Well, the director thinks the game is shit. His words.
Oh yeah, well,
so
he'd be inclined to agree with you.
Yeah, it's not that the game was in and of itself like unable to be released. It's just that by the time Resident Evil 2 came out, Capcom knew that they had a property they can milk for all it's worth. Right? That sounds really bad, but this was the Mega Man company and the Street Fighter company, and they wanted to do the same thing with Resident Evil, where they churned out as many as they could. But they realized that the game had to be good from entry to entry in order for the series to be to sustain its level of success. And everyone I've ever spoken to in the development team didn't actually like how this game was turning out. And I think there's a completed version out on the internet somewhere that was created when people compiled the development code and they were able to finish it. And I've played some of it, but I actually have never been able to finish it because I actually don't think it's a very good game.
So you're not a fan either?
No. I mean, compared to what came out, no. Is it a fascinating piece of development history? Yes. But I just think the final Resident Evil 2 is a lot better.
That intrigues me so much that you ended up not liking it either.
I mean, maybe I'm just biased. Maybe I'm tainted because I have a great relationship with Hideki Kamiya. And before COVID-19 anyway, I met up with him every once in a while. We did a live stream together last year. And he's never had a good thing to say about this game. He sees it as a failure and evidence of his inability at the time to really hone in on a specific direction for a game. Now, and I think looking at the footage here, it just
let me ask
there's
you
something
this.
about it that just doesn't seem to come well together. Yeah.
Do you think that on a global scale, people would have also disliked it because you think that his inability as a developer at the time was stunted, or do you think?
I mean, I don't think. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think the average person would be privy to how the director feels about his game, his project personally. I think if Resident Evil 1.5 had come out, I mean, it probably would have sold 1 million copies, but I think it would have stunted the momentum of the series because it probably wouldn't have gotten excellent reviews, and I think it would have been a little underwhelming compared to the first game, and maybe the series wouldn't have the presence that it has today if that had happened. Because later on in Resident Evil history, we'll find out that when you release games like Resident Evil 0 or Resident Evil 6 or Operation Raccoon City, that does have negative effects on a franchise's reputation. So, this being only the second game, I think that would have, put Capcom at a fairly big risk with regards to the property. Because you have to remember, like, you look back at Mega Man 2 is seen as one of the best games in the end, one of the best entries in the series. And that was Mega Man's first million seller. And obviously Street Fighter 2 was far more successful than Street Fighter 1. So, there was this, I mean, I wouldn't call it a pattern, but Capcom did have a reputation for making kick-ass second entries in their franchises. And I don't think And I think they did pretty well with that until Devil May Cry 2 came out.
Oh, I know, yeah. Gosh.
Agreed. And we will,
Right.
we will, of course, touch on Devil May Cry because that is totally intertwined with Resident Evil. But if we could just rewind a little bit with Resident Evil 1.5. I played the recent build of the recent modified build of Resident Evil 1.5, and I very much take your comments on board that it's a very cool novelty, but it is very bland and it's too much like the original. Resident Evil 2 was so different, and it's my favorite. Resident Evil 2 1998 is by far my favorite in the series, and it always has been. But Resident Evil 2 was so much different. That's why it was good. It took the concept of the Resident Evil story and just made it to me like a mad Hollywood blockbuster with like 4 different scenarios. Right. And it was just absolutely crazy. But Resident Evil 1.5, it just even the police station, it just lacked character.
Yeah, it seemed very much in the vein of the original game. But yeah, it didn't seem like it would take things much further than where the original had been, especially visually, but also like in terms of the gameplay loop. I feel like a lot of the ingenuity with Resident Evil 1 was just not there. So when, in I guess, resuscitating the Resident Evil 2 project, they brought on Sugimura, Noboru Sugimura, a writer who had written for Japanese TV shows like Sentai, the Japanese version of Power Rangers.
I love that show.
Yeah, it's
I love
fantastic.
That. That's
and,
great stuff there.
And the stories aren't literary genius or anything like that, but they're fun to watch, in terms of the entertainment factor. And Sugimura joined the team and provided a lot of invaluable advice when it came to rebooting the game. And basically, I think his biggest contribution was to tell the developers, scale the game up, make it even bigger and even madder and even more ingenious than the first game. And you can tell with the visuals that the team really took that to heart and they really pushed the PlayStation hardware. One other thing I want to mention about Resident Evil 1.5 is that if it had come out the way it was, I mean, if you look at that compared to Parasite Eve or Silent Hill, which came out just a year later, I think I agree with Capcom that it would have paled in comparison. So I think there's a bit of a competitive edge and a motivation to stay competitive. And I'm really glad that they took Sugimura's advice to heart. They expanded the story. We had the zapping system, so there was a lot more depth to the multi-character system. The story was more thematic. I mean, it's nothing profound, but you can tell like the relationships between characters in Resident Evil 2 are much deeper than.
Yeah, well, I mean, they took out Elsa in favor for Claire, which now it directly ties the second one to the first game, whereas 1.5 not so much.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that was a very, very wise choice in terms of franchise building.
Yeah, I would say so.
Agreed. And as Resident Evil 2 as a game, I felt like it did take itself a little bit. I mean, looking back at it, it's still relatively B-movie, but it did take itself a little bit more seriously than like in terms of like the delivery of voice acting, the directing of characters. I did feel like it was a little bit more serious. But again, looking back, it still pales. Yeah. It still pales to say the new Resident Evil 2 remake. But again, technology's evolved, game designers has evolved. But I do think this is the complete Resident Evil 2, of course.
Yeah, and I think the voice acting is a lot better than it was in the original game because they actually recorded them in an English-speaking country. They did the recordings in Canada, which was also a very new thing for Capcom as a company. Like with the original game, they just found any English-speaking person they can find living in Tokyo, which didn't bode well for the talent pool. But I think that was the first project where they worked with Alison Court, the voice actress of Claire, and they still had a budget, and I think Kamiya had to do a lot of the direction, even though he understands English very well, but he's not very confident at speaking it, like in 2020, right? So I can't imagine where his skill level was at back in 1998. But they made the best out of what they could, and I think Resident Evil 2 has, for the time, pretty good voice acting. Nothing or very little about the game really sticks out as particularly problematic, unlike the first game, where every line was problematic, right?
Well, but they were made to be over dramatic and stuff in the first game, right? That was the direction they took.
Kind of. It was more that Mikami wanted Japanese people to understand what the people were saying, even though there was no Japanese dub in the final game.
I see.
So literally in Japan, people study English. Back then it was starting in middle school or in junior high. Now it's, I think, from 4th or 5th grade in elementary school. But the average Japanese person, they can read very basic English, but not everyone is conversant to a deep level. So when you have lines like "I have this," that's literally anybody in Japan will know what that means, right?
Yeah. It's become iconic here.
Look! It's a monster. That's very basic English for people here. So
yeah,
it. With Resident Evil 2, they pulled away from that and they made it much deeper. So yeah, when Resident Evil 2 came out, it was like Street Fighter 2 in the sense that it just felt so much bigger and more significant than the previous game. And I think the unprecedented level of success that game experienced when it came out was well earned, I think. When Resident Evil 2 came out in Japan, it sold somewhere, I think, 1,200,000 copies, which was unheard of at the time for anything that wasn't a Final Fantasy or a Dragon Quest. So I think the only other game from that era that could pull those kinds of numbers were Pokemon games. So I think, Capcom really with Resident Evil 1, the signs were there that they had a global phenomenon on their hands. But with Resident Evil 2, there was just no question how significant the game's success was.
In Resident Evil 2, they actually brought in actual voice talent, right? That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's when they started working with Alison Court. They went to Canada to actually do the recordings.
Oh, that's right. You said
that's crazy.
So,
that's crazy.
Yeah.
So we've spoken about Resident Evil 2. I think this is a very, very interesting time in the Resident Evil universe, because then we went in kind of two directions. We went to Resident Evil 3, but at the same time, it's actually more than two directions, because you had Resident Evil 3. At the same time, Capcom were focusing on Dino Crisis. You also had Resident Evil Survivor and Resident Evil Code Veronica in the space of 18 months?
I do believe they're working on the pre-build of Zero at that time too, right?
Yeah. Excuse me as well.
Yeah, so
these guys putting all their eggs in one basket after that too release.
So Alex, where should we start from here if we was working in timeline in chronological order?
Right. So Capcom tends to you can describe it in multiple ways. Getting carried away might be one, but this is going to require the mother of all explanations. But the intention was for Resident Evil to always be a multi-platform franchise. Capcom as a company is by nature platform agnostic, so they want to support Nintendo, Sega, and Sony, and today Microsoft, to varying levels. Things are a lot more equal these days, but back then there were no multi-platform video game engines or cross-compatible development tools. So everything had to be made from scratch. So even though some games like Street Fighter 2, for example, were on both Super Nintendo and Genesis and the arcade and the PC for that matter, a lot of those games had to be reprogrammed from the ground up. And so that's why multi-platform simultaneous Resident Evil games were very uncommon for the first 10 or so years of the series' history. So Resident Evil 1 was developed on on PlayStation rather. They finished that, then they outsourced the Saturn version to another company because they also wanted to establish the franchise on Sega's platform. With Resident Evil 2, that was actually planned to be Saturn and PlayStation from the very beginning, before release, even in the 1.5 days. But the Saturn version would have to come out after because that was being developed separately. With the Saturn version of Resident Evil 2, they were unable to get the game running technologically because, again, the Saturn wasn't really a 3D focused hardware, and it was very difficult to develop for. So if you look at the visuals of Resident Evil 2, apparently it would have been very difficult to get that look running on the Saturn. So yeah, but Capcom had a very good relationship with Sega, and they wanted to continue that. So they unfortunately had to cancel Resident Evil 2 on Saturn, but at the same time, the Dreamcast was coming up. The Dreamcast was released in November 1998, which was almost a year before the West. Mm-hmm. So Capcom wanted to have a new Resident Evil game for next-gen hardware, specifically for Dreamcast. So in 1998, that is how Resident Evil Code Veronica was greenlit. So they didn't give Code Veronica a number because the top producer at Capcom at the time, Yoshiki Okamoto, wanted PlayStation systems to have the numbered entries. Really? But the intention, exactly. But the intention was for Resident Evil Code Veronica to be the direct successor in terms of story to Resident Evil 1. So at the time it was greenlit, Code Veronica was actually supposed to have Jill and Chris.
Really?
And thematically, exactly, yeah. Thematically, it was going to be a lot closer to the first game than it was going to be to the second game. That eventually changed. The game ended up having Claire instead of Jill, but that was the very original concept. And then the other big game that they greenlit in 1998 was Resident Evil 0 because they wanted the the N64 to have its own Resident Evil game as well. And with numbered Resident Evils being a PlayStation thing, they settled on 0 for the Nintendo fan base. The reason they went with the 0 idea was because being a prequel, if you were a Nintendo fan who had never played Resident Evil 1 or 2, you wouldn't really be lost in terms of where you were in the timeline. Sega fans had already gotten the first game on Saturn, so Capcom felt comfortable enough to continue the timeline on Sega hardware. Plus, they were going to bring Resident Evil 2 on Dreamcast as well. So eventually, they would have stayed abreast of where the timeline was. But Nintendo fans would have gone back to the very beginning, so they could get into the series without having to be encumbered by lore. The other entries. Yeah, the 1 and 2 lore, exactly.
I never even thought about that. I've never even thought about that. That's interesting that you say that. And it's funny. That's actually really more interesting, the fact that you got RE1 remake eventually on the GameCube with 0. So it's like you got the two actual precursors of the whole franchise right there. So that was their introduction anyway, was the very beginning. That's crazy. I'd never thought about it that way. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean the remake was a later development, but in spring 1998, Capcom saw unprecedented success with Resident Evil 2, and they had to bring it everywhere. And so a prequel for Nintendo owners and a non-numbered sequel for Sega owners were two of those ideas. And then the third idea, and I guess the main thing was what was originally Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation 2, which there have been various ideas about it over the years, like the one with Hunk on the boat, for example.
Yeah, which I still would have loved to see.
Right. And then there was the game that eventually became Devil May Cry. That was another version of Resident Evil 3/4. Like I haven't even gotten to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis yet, but that was actually greenlit.
There's so much going
Yeah,
on.
Nemesis was greenlit a little bit after Code Veronica and Zero, and what it eventually became Devil May Cry / Resident Evil 4. And the reason why Nemesis exists was because Capcom realized that developing a new Resident Evil game on PlayStation 2 was going to take a lot of time, and they needed a fill-in title to kind of, bring the money in while we waited for PlayStation 2 to come out. So Dino Crisis was the other one, actually. So they made Dino Crisis, and then they made Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And Resident Evil 3 Nemesis originally was known as Resident Evil 1.9 during development. And it was going to be it was going to originally star Nikolai, Mikhail, and Carlos as the playable characters. It wasn't really going to be a story. And the whole idea was for players to just shoot zombies and escape Raccoon City. It wasn't really going to be a terribly important game, but because the PlayStation 2 Resident Evil was taking much longer than expected, they wanted something to fill in those shoes in the interim. So they ended up changing the name from Resident Evil 1.9 to Resident Evil Nemesis. And then they ended up, for various reasons, they added Jill into the storyline and they expanded that outward. And they ended up adding the number 3 to it relatively late in development. So that's why you look at Resident Evil 1, you look at Resident Evil 2, you look at Code Veronica, you look at Zero, and they're all like dual protagonists. Resident Evil 3 has all these gameplay quirks that just don't appear in other Resident Evil games at the time, such as the dodge and the live events and the randomized puzzle solutions. And that's because fundamentally Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was supposed to be a short game, and they wanted to pump up the replay value by adding all these randomized elements to it. You don't see that, like, for example, in Code Veronica, because Code Veronica was not designed to be like that. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was deliberately designed to be a game that has its own direction that doesn't influence what the mainline Resident Evil games were supposed to be. So, if you draw a comparison to today, like you wouldn't imagine Resident Evil Revelations to have gameplay that's seen in Resident Evil 5 or Resident Evil 6, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So imagine if Resident Evil Revelations had been called Resident Evil 5, but they didn't actually change much of the game, right? That's pretty much how Nemesis kind of ended up being what it is. And that's why it's so different. So that's why there's a lot of confusion as to whether that's the real Resident Evil 3 or if Code Veronica was a more significant game.
We always hear that.
In my head canon, it's always Code Veronica, just because of how much more in my eyes, how much more effort it seems to have been effortlessly put into the game.
Yeah, it's a longer game, it's a more complete game.
I'm also a lore junkie. And I love the story building around Resident Evil. And Chris Redfield is my favorite character. So as a 14-year-old kid, it spoke to me. And then you got the resolution of Claire looking for her brother, and then obviously at the very end is Chris's ending line.
Absolutely,
yeah. So you thinking, oh, what's going to happen next? And then I believe. What was I'm actually drawing a blank. What was the direct sequel after Code Veronica?
It would have been Resident Evil 4.
Or Dark Side Chronicles?
Well, I mean,
in terms of the lore? Or?
No, in terms of what was that right after Code Veronica?
Zero.
Which was the last was actually the departure of fixed camera angles and stuff like that. So
what was going to pick up on is there is a complete anomaly that was released on the PlayStation.
Oh, this game.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. What's going on here, Alex? Fill us in.
So, yeah, the other thing that Capcom wanted to do in 1998 after Resident Evil 2 was very successful was to test Resident Evil out in other genres. House of the Dead had become pretty popular at the time, and I think the success of those PC first-person shooters had caught Capcom's attention, so they wanted to see how compatible Resident Evil was with first-person. And as we all know, that was the original concept in the first game. So I mean, even though Resident Evil Survivor isn't an amazing game by any degree, it is interesting to see that by the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, Capcom did manage to make that first-person game that they originally set out to make. This game was not developed inside Capcom. It was the first spin-off that was outsourced to a completely separate company called Tosei. So, yeah, Tosei created this game, and yeah, it's not horrible. Like, I've played worse games for sure, but
I feel like it's someone was telling me one time when I was playing this. It's like if they had to choose between this or Doom, OG Doom, they'd choose this. It's like a better version. Yeah, and I would have to agree with them. I actually do enjoy this. I find enjoyment out of this game. I do like it.
I do feel like it's a bit of a tech demo for what because this in my eyes, and not a lot, and I believe I'm correct in saying this, so I don't want to spout fake facts or anything like that. But this is the first 3D rendered Resident Evil in fully 3D. Not pre-rendered backgrounds. It's got full 3D environments. So, because I believe Dino Crisis was the first fixed camera angle one, but this was the first 3D rendered Resident Evil. So it feels like
it depends on the timeline we're looking at, because this game came out in Japan only 1 week before Code Veronica. So yes, technically, it was the first fully polygonal 3D Resident Evil ever released. That said, the demo of Code Veronica came out before this, so you can argue that Code Veronica as a product was the first 3D Resident Evil game, depending on what your standard is.
It's weird that it seems like this game and Code Veronica are seamlessly intertwined. Or is it?
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
They both have the same writer. I think Sugimura wrote for both games. So I think there was an intentional sense of minimal, but notable, not notable, but minimal continuity between the two games.
Code Veronica was the better of the two, but I'm glad you got it right the second time.
So we've kind of capped off the PlayStation saga of Resident Evil games. Let's move on to. I mean, we did have Resident Evil Gaiden in there. I'm not sure if you've got any kind of factoids behind that you'd like to share. I mean, it's kind of
the development of Gaiden is very well documented on. I think the site was called Now Gamer. I don't know if the article is still up today, and I do talk about it in the book, but it's not really my focus. I mean, Resident Evil Gaiden, before that, there was the conversion of Resident Evil 1 on the Game Boy Color that Capcom wanted to release, which was another game that they greenlit in 1998. And as we might all remember, they released Resident Evil 2 on the Game.com. So, Capcom, even relatively early on, had these ambitions to bring Resident Evil to portable systems to, relatively low levels of success, or absolutely low levels of success. This game never came out. So Gaiden was like the compromise title where they decided to use the IP, but they changed the gameplay around a lot to suit the platform. I mean, Gaiden, I would say it's treated more unfairly than Resident Evil Survivor is, right? I think Resident Evil Survivor pales in comparison to a lot of first-person shooters like GoldenEye or Doom or Half-Life or whatever. But I think Resident Evil Gaiden is interesting as a Game Boy Color game. I just think it was treated very poorly upon release because it just kind of came out when Resident Evil Remake came out, right? And I think people had already moved on to the Game Boy Advance, whereas this was a Game Boy Color game, so it started to feel old in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think Gaiden it's a fascinating title to look at. I don't think it's amazing or anything. I don't think it holds a candle to Capcom's NES games, for example. But I think it showed Capcom what worked and what didn't work with regards to expanding the Resident Evil franchise outward. I think no one on the team except Hiroki Kato, who also directed Code Veronica and wrote Wesker's Report, participated in the development of this title. I think he wrote the story, but that's pretty much it.
Okay. No, thank you for that. That's I kind of wanted to throw it in there, but it's not to me. It's kind of another offshoot of Resident Evil, but it's good we got a little bit of gen on that. So let's move on to, and I think this is going to be the next one. This is going to be Resident Evil 0. I would like to tie both the N64 port and the GameCube port into one point, if I may. So if we could start with the N64. I mean, what's going on here, Alex? It's going to be a common theme.
Yeah. Sure. As I mentioned earlier, this was greenlit in 1998, right after Resident Evil 2 came out. So this was going to be the big Resident Evil game for Nintendo fans. And by making it a prequel, as a Nintendo fan, you wouldn't have to buy a PlayStation in order to know what was going on. It looks very similar to Resident Evil 2, visually and conceptually. Obviously, this is very famous history, but the Nintendo 64 ran on cartridges, so there were going to be inherent space limitations with regards to how much content they can put in the game. Voice acting is a relative rarity in Nintendo 64 games. CG video for the longest time was practically unheard of on N64, and so these are the biggest challenges for bringing Resident Evil to the platform. They initially greenlit Resident Evil 0 for the 64 DD, if you remember that
The
accessory that would use, like specialized versions of, I don't know if they're floppy disks, but they're not CDs. They're like they're still like the cartridge-like format. Yeah, I think. Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. I can't remember what their capacities were, but it was maybe like 64 megabytes.
I think that they maxed out at 64.
Megabytes or megabits?
I think it's a
I
megabyte.
never remember.
Yeah, I mean the N64 was it was the last cartridge, which was super limiting. It was the last cartridge, and we know this from the absolute technological masterpiece that was the N64 port of Resident Evil 2. So they was already kind of working on an uphill slope here.
Exactly. So Resident Evil 2 was actually greenlit for N64 in late 1997, and that was going to serve as the litmus test for the feasibility of the franchise on the platform. And apparently Angel Studios, which is now Rockstar, one of Rockstar's development studios, I think they were based in San Diego, but apparently they found a lot of success early on in the porting process, but it was just taking a lot of time because there was so much data compression involved. But they found out early enough that you could run a Resident Evil game on N64, and that's how 0 got greenlit, and that's how they commenced development. But as we all know, that generation of games was about to come to a close. The 64 DD did come out, but it was a flop, and it would never come out in the West. So Capcom eventually put it on the standard Nintendo 64 cartridge. Again, thanks to Resident Evil 2 making that possible. But for a new game, it was still very difficult in the end for Capcom to finish off the game on N64. And so in I think it was late 1999 or early 2000, they made the decision to move development of Resident Evil 0 over from N64 to the successor console called the Dolphin, which was eventually named, into the GameCube. That system would use discs, so the problem of not having enough storage capacity went away. The flip side to that was part of the reason why Resident Evil 0 has 2 characters that you control simultaneously is because the game uses cartridges, and N64 cartridges were free of loading times. So that was Capcom's attempt to use the N64 hardware in a way where the PlayStation or even the Dreamcast wouldn't be able to mimic the same experience. So porting the game to GameCube meant that they'd have to figure out a new solution for the simultaneous dual protagonist dynamic. But luckily, the GameCube hardware was actually quite capable in terms of managing load times, so they were able to implement that very effectively. So
Zero was the title that they tried to make a nod to Sweet Home, right? With the whole leaving the stuff on the floor, coming back to the later,
Right.
much like that mechanic. And this one was directed or made, if I'm correct, simultaneously next to RE1 remake, right?
I mean, it started development before, but yeah, I think Resident Evil 1 remake was greenlit in late 2000. I think in November.
What was the
And
logic behind both of these, by the way? I mean, this was only 5 or 6 years later. Why did they need to do it all? That just seems crazy to me.
Right. 6 years is a pretty short gap for a game to be remade to that extent. Like we just got Resident Evil 5 and 6 on Switch, and they were older then than Resident Evil 1 was when it was remade. So it's really fascinating to think about these timelines. But it's complicated. So Resident Evil 0 was greenlit for GameCube, and that originally was the only Resident Evil game they were going to bring to the system. At the same time, Devil May Cry became its own thing, and Resident Evil 4 was once again in development for PlayStation 2. But my understanding is that Mikami was unhappy with how difficult it was to develop for PlayStation 2's hardware. He felt that the difficulty in programming for it did not commensurate with the output of the game, and he thought that Nintendo was a more favorable partner in this regard. The GameCube was more powerful than the PlayStation 2, and it was a lot easier to develop for. And the Xbox hadn't really made a name for itself at this time, so he felt with Sega out of the picture, with Microsoft not really a full player yet, and with PlayStation so hard to develop for, he wanted to see where he could take the Resident Evil franchise on Nintendo hardware. So the thing to pay attention to is that Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 remake were developed by different teams.
One held by Koji Oda, right?
Yeah, Koji Oda was the director, but Tatsuya Minami, whom we all found out was the producer on RE3 remake, and the ex-president of Platinum Games, actually. He was the producer of, at the time, Production Studio 3, and Mikami was the head of Production Studio 4. So the two games were in development simultaneously, but by different development teams. The only things that they shared were the technology.
And which is imminent because the story doesn't intertwine too well.
Yeah, like on side note on that, the reason why 0 and 1 remake don't seem to tie very closely together was because even though Resident Evil 0 was rebooted on GameCube, the concept didn't change from the N64 days, and the N64 concept was made before Remake 1 was a thing, and they didn't make those adjustments.
I see.
At deep levels, which is why, I mean, it harkens back to the fact that they wanted N64 owners to not feel compelled to have to play Resident Evil 1 on other hardware.
Okay.
So that's why 0 still has this sense of being a standalone title. When they moved it to GameCube, they didn't adjust for that. And I do think that did hurt the game to some extent. But in terms of the development itself, with Mikami dissatisfied with the PlayStation 2, he decided to move Resident Evil 4 over to the GameCube as well. But the thing is, as of late 2000, Mikami's team was not familiar with the GameCube hardware. So they decided to dip their toes in the pond and make a remake of Resident Evil 1 on the GameCube hardware so they could, one, familiarize themselves in preparation for Resident Evil 4 and lay the groundwork for the technology for Resident Evil 0. So the fascinating thing was Resident Evil 1 was actually the last Resident Evil game to be greenlit on GameCube, according to Mikami.
Really?
So they moved 0 over. They decided they decided to put Resident Evil 4 on GameCube, and then after that, they also decided to port 2, 3, and Code Veronica over to GameCube. So there was a point where the 5 Resident Evil games on GameCube were going to be 0, 2, 3, Code Veronica, and 4. So that left Resident Evil 1 as kind of the last game to be greenlit for the system. So like I guess the puzzle pieces just kind of fell into place, and Resident Evil 1 was kind of the guinea pig for or it laid the groundwork for what the series would become on GameCube. So Resident Evil 1 Remake, even though we loved the game very much, that was very much a glorified tech experiment for Capcom.
Really?
And it turns out to be, I would argue, one of the best.
That's crazy that you say that.
Yeah.
That is my absolute favorite Resident Evil game ever. That's the one that made me fall in love with the series. This is the one, like, this game made me, like, I had played the original back when I was like 6 or 7. My older brother had it or whatever it may be, but I didn't get my actual own experience until I got a GameCube when I was like 9. And then this is the game that sold me on the entire franchise. I had played 2 before. I liked it, but as a small-minded child, I was like, oh, okay, polygons. But looking at this, it was beautiful, and I was actually terribly frightened by the atmosphere that this game provided. It was insane to me.
Oh, absolutely. And it's fascinating, but because Resident Evil 1 was basically a test run for Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 0, you'll notice that even though the game is absolutely beautiful, the production values are certainly much lower than Resident Evil 0. You can see that in the quality of the CG, for example. Like with Resident Evil 0, the budget was so much higher than Resident Evil Remake, that the CG in 0 is just so much better. The music, in my opinion, is mixed and produced a lot better than the remake. And I think they went with better voice actors for 0 as well. So 0 was the big game that Capcom had expectations for on the GameCube. Remake 1 was just like
crazy. Yeah. That is funny. It's funny because
that totally makes sense, because there is so much more CG in Resident Evil 0 than there is in Resident Evil Remake.
I didn't even realize it till you said it. Like there was
and the backgrounds as well. You'll notice how, even though they're only a few months apart on the same hardware, Resident Evil 0 looks so much better than Resident Evil Remake, right? And the reason for that is because even though Resident Evil 0 was technically outsourced to an extent to Tosei, like Capcom hired a lot of graphic artists for the game, and they spent a lot of time making very high resolution backgrounds.
I think it was Resident Evil 0 was the first
0, like partly moving backgrounds, and I mean it's all CG, but it definitely required a very large production team. So Resident Evil 0 had the biggest development team at the time of release. If you watch the credits, you'll notice how much longer it is compared to Resident Evil Remake, right? With all the names that just kind of pop up. So Resident Evil 0 had a humongous budget at the time. And unfortunately, it didn't sell as well as it needed to for Capcom to consider it a success.
I love that
Partly
game
because
too.
The GameCube. Yeah, I like Resident Evil 0 a lot. I can see why people don't like it for one reason or another. And I do think I don't think it's entirely fair to say that Resident Evil 0 was the death of fixed camera Resident Evil, but
I don't think it's fair to say that either. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
I would say it was the GameCube that was really the bigger problem. And you can tell when the HD remasters came out that 0 and Remake sold very well.
Yeah.
So I do think there's definitely still an audience for the old classic Resident Evil games. But Capcom doesn't want to try. But the reason why is because Resident Evil 0 didn't sell well enough to warrant all the resources that were poured into it.
And it sucks because Resident Evil 0 is a complete original Resident Evil fixed camera angle tank controls experience. I think it's great.
Right.
If you're an OG if you're an OG fan, that you will love Resident Evil 0.
I mean, to be fair, Remake is probably a lot better in a lot of ways.
Oh well, yeah, it's my favorite.
And I can see, if Resident Evil Remake didn't exist, maybe 0 would have gotten a better reception. But I think unintentionally the remake turned out to be one of Capcom's best games ever. So that leads us basically to why the series changed so dramatically after that. So
Okay. This is I thought I knew about Resident Evil, but this is just like and we will this is all and a majority of this content is going to be in your book Itchy Tasty, the unofficial guide to Resident Evil, which we will continually plug throughout this podcast, and we'll have a link in the description when we post it. No, it's okay. This is golden. So what I'm going to do is we're going to move into kind of two different directions here. We're going to talk about Resident Evil 4, and then after that, we'll talk about I like to call them like the PlayStation spin-offs, where it was just like bang, 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 loads of different original concepts of Resident Evil. But Resident Evil 4 had quite a complex development cycle. So let's go from the very start of that. What occurred?
So Resident Evil 4 was originally Resident Evil 3. In terms of its position within the series timeline. And that was greenlit in 1998, right after Resident Evil 2 came out, and Kamiya was the original director. Kamiya felt that he couldn't do more on the PlayStation, like he had maxed out the capabilities of the system, so he wanted to move on to the next gen consoles for PlayStation 2. But Kamiya actually really hates horror games. He's not very good at stomaching the whole grotesque kind of vibe. And you can tell with Resident Evil 2 that it definitely did start to pull away from that horror focus, more toward action. And, he's known for Bayonetta and Beautiful Joe and The Wonderful 101. So he's not really a horror game creator at heart. He just directed Resident Evil 2 because Mikami asked him to. But that game took forever, and it got rebooted into Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry comes out on PlayStation 2, becomes very successful, and Kamiya's career kind of goes off in another direction. I think he did Beautiful Joe and Okami after that. But going back to Resident Evil 4, it finally got moved over to GameCube. And by the way, it became 4 because Resident Evil Nemesis became Resident Evil 3. So that's the whole...
Yeah, and then that's when all that interchangeable stuff of titles of Code Veronica becoming 3 and then it didn't, and then...
Right. I mean, Code Veronica was never 3.
Well, I mean, but chronologically, yeah.
But that's an interesting... Just to pick up on that minor point there, I've always heard that there's always been the discussion of, is Resident Evil 3 the actual Resident Evil 3 or was it Code Veronica? But I've never heard the theory that Resident Evil 4 was meant to be Resident Evil 3. That's an eye-opener for me.
It was meant to be the third Resident Evil game. Third entry in the Resident Evil main timeline.
See, that confuses me as to what the story was for 4 originally.
It was the concept with Hunk on the boat looking for something.
See, where is this? I feel like I've got a bit of a brain fart here. I'm not familiar with this concept of Hunk in this boat. Can somebody please just elaborate?
I mean, it wasn't. It's not like it made it very far in development, but that was one of the original plans. I don't even know if that was Kamiya's specific idea. I know he's kind of pushed back against that, but I think the super original idea of Resident Evil 3 was Gothic in a castle with superpowers, also known as Devil May Cry. Yeah. And then when they realized that needed to become its own thing, they spun that off. At the same time, the number changed from Resident Evil 3 to Resident Evil 4 because they realized it would have taken 1,000,000 years for Resident Evil 4 to come out. So they decided to take Resident Evil Nemesis and make that into Resident Evil 3, which slid Kamiya's Resident Evil 3 over one. That became Devil May Cry, and it stopped being Resident Evil 4. And then Resident Evil 4 was taken over by Mikami, who had another person direct the game. I think his name was Hiroshi Shibata. And that's kind of where the very first trailer of Resident Evil 4 proper on the GameCube comes out in November 2002 with the castle and the flying airship-like thing and the staircase and that swarm of progenitor virus. So this concept was in development for about a year or so. And then they kind of shifted the vision over to the second trailer that we got, with Leon hallucinating and the Hook Man chasing him. But you can see how high fidelity the graphics are
It looked
these
amazing.
two trailers of Resident Evil 4, and this wasn't a pre-rendered game. If you look at other 3D games at the time, like Silent Hill 2 or Silent Hill 3, Fatal Frame, none of them had visuals of this fidelity. And
Gorgeous.
exactly. But the problem was the GameCube hardware couldn't really handle this.
So what was this running on?
In
Was
the
this
end?
running on a
Yeah.
computer?
Yeah, what was this running on?
It was the engine. I guess it was the same engine as the final version of Resident Evil 4, but repurposed for smaller environments with a lot of detail, pure detail in the textures. But the problem was, according to the planner of this game, in order for the hallucination scenes to take place, they needed a lot of memory that can load two different versions of the environment at the same time. And unfortunately, for all the power that the GameCube had, memory was actually not one of them. Like, it actually has lower memory capacity than hardware memory capacity than the other two systems. Of course, it makes up for it in other regards, but in terms of being able to shift between the two different styles seamlessly, the GameCube hardware couldn't handle it. So they had to abandon this concept entirely. And the reason why the whole hallucination thing was such a big part of the gameplay dynamic was because the story was written to account for that. And Resident Evil 4 itself had already, at this point, been greenlit 4 years back and still hadn't come out, right? And so when this concept was failing at the technical level, Mikami had to step in once again and say, hey, this isn't working. Resident Evil 4 is never going to come out at this stage. So Mikami decided to direct the game and change the direction drastically. So the first thing that he decided to do when he became the director of Resident Evil 4 was to ignore the story. Because from his point of view, because Resident Evil 4 had initially paid too much attention to the story affecting the gameplay, Mikami decided, story's not going to matter. We're going to take the timeline forward and we're going to basically ignore everything that had happened up until this point. We're going to change the gameplay entirely. And so we ended up with what we know today as Resident Evil 4. So,
that makes entire sense.
people complain about the story and how it's very different and very nonsensical compared to other Resident Evil games, and how the writing might be questionable. But Mikami's number one goal was to make a story that just didn't matter. Right? It was a means to an end.
And that's a very
and he
valid
was going
point.
to Right, he's going to focus all on the gameplay and how to make that very unique and very different, and to make it more modern as well. Because by this point, Western games had begun to start eclipsing Japanese games, and in terms of popularity. So
and it's very apparent too.
GTA, right? Mm-hmm.
It's super apparent, especially with how little the story has anything to do with, and it's very apparent at the beginning where they say, "Oh, Umbrella's basically done. Okay, next."
Yeah. Let's
right.
crack on.
and it's like forget Bayer says, "Here's a parasite." Oh, here's Leon. Last time we saw him was in Resident Evil 2, where he was a rookie cop, and now he's an action star.
Right, exactly. And this dramatic change was necessary because the previous version of Resident Evil 4 was not feasible on using the technology at the time, and Resident Evil 0 had undersold as well. So Mikami realized that things had to change or the series was going to die out, right? And I think not to blame Resident Evil 0 again, but other survival horror games at the time like Fatal Frame and Silent Hill didn't really sell huge numbers. So I think they realized where they needed to go. Devil May Cry and Onimusha were far more successful games for the company. So that was the beginning of making Resident Evil a more action-oriented, combat-based franchise as well. And Mikami, quite frankly, he hit it out of the park. Like, I don't think I've never played anything quite quite as significant and impressive as Resident Evil 4.
And
so do you think? Sorry to talk over you, Matt. But do you think that do you think that was a good thing for them to do? Obviously, picking up on the fact that Fatal Frame wasn't doing well, Sun Hill wasn't doing well, and the GameCube, because at this point, Resident Evil 4 was only a GameCube exclusive at this point. Do you think on reflection that it was a good idea for them to move to more of an action oriented experience, to kind of, even though we've returned back to it now, to kind of prolong the series?
Yes, I do believe that a move like this was going to become necessary. I mean, I wouldn't have imagined it to turn out specifically the way it did, but that just goes back to giving Mikami credit for, you know, doing what was right and not what people were expecting him to do. I do think that seeing what happened with other survival horror franchises after that era of games, I do think this was inevitable to some extent.
Yeah, it's more like Resident Evil just evolved with the times. That really is what happened. And the thing is, imagine if we didn't get that build of Resident Evil, we did get the Hookman build, which is interesting to think about, because the current Resident Evil that we have now, it was very much a precursor to all those action games that we saw on the PS3. The over-the-shoulder, action-oriented with melee combat after you stun an enemy. Like, it really was. It pioneered that whole third-person shooter a genre, in my opinion. Not many games were like that back then.
Yeah, pioneering a genre does not come very easily, right? And Mikami did not expect that to happen.
We did it twice.
You know, every time I tell Mikami how great Resident Evil 4 is, his response is always, "Oh, Kami is better." Right? So even, I mean, he understands his success, but he doesn't necessarily revel in it like even people like me do, right? Resident Evil 4 is definitely my favorite.
That's such a hard comparison. Yeah. So Resident Evil 4 is one of your favorites then?
I would say it's my favorite.
Okay.
By far. Just holistically, it just does so much right. And it's, for a game that's already 15 years old at this point, it's really hard to find fault with it. The biggest criticisms I see are story, or, you know, the controls are a little old, you know, yeah, fair enough. But when in 2005, we weren't sure how 3D gaming was going to evolve. And this was by far the first sign of where things are going to go.
Yeah.
You're great.
Yeah.
I find a lot of comparisons into. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Andy. But I compare Resident Evil 4 a lot to Resident Evil Dead Aim. I just see a lot of comparisons in those two games. A lot. I don't know how closely they were when they released, though.
Yeah, it's always interesting especially when 15 Resident Evil games would come out at the same time. You would wonder how much influence they had on one another. But the thing is, at the time, each Capcom studio was very secretive to an extent. So there was like Production Studio 1, which made games like the 2D Fighters, or they made like Devil May Cry 2 and onward, I think. Yeah, exactly. Well, back in the day, it would have been MVC 1, MVC 2.
Oh, yeah, 1 or 2, yeah.
They made Auto Modalista, that racing game with the cel-shaded graphics. And then they also made Resident Evil Outbreak 1 and 2. So they were very secretive, and they weren't sure what was going on with Production Studio 4, which was making Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Remake, the Capcom 5, PM3, Beautiful Joe, Dead Phoenix, Killer 7, or 3 for that matter, Production Studio 3, which made, I think, Clock Tower 3 as well. So they did very little talking to each other, and there was almost no technology sharing whatsoever. So that's why...
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, my understanding is that Devil May Cry 2 runs on a different engine than Devil May Cry 1.
Really?
Onimusha ran on its own engine. Onimusha 2 and 3 ran on their own engine as well. Dino Crisis 3 was on its own engine. Resident Evil Dead Aim was developed by Cavia. That was an outsourced studio. They eventually made the Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles and Resident Evil Dark Side Chronicles titles as well. So I think
Okay.
conceptually, the creative team behind Resident Evil Dead Aim had nothing to do with Mikami and Resident Evil 4.
Okay.
I would imagine maybe the perspective shifting might have given Mikami an idea or two, but he's never referenced Resident Evil Dead Aim as a direct source of inspiration for Resident
The
Evil
only
4.
comparisons I really see, and if I'm being quite frank, is when is like obviously door transitions, where it fades out and stuff like that, and obviously the third person perspective where I don't know, the models look very similar to me, kind of. Obviously, Resident Evil 4 is a little more upscaled, a little more textured, a little more tasteful. I always figured that there was some technology sharing because of that, but it's really surprising to hear that there wasn't at all.
Bringing it,
Yeah, I
bringing
mean,
it full, oh, go on, as you were. Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, bringing it for now, we're actually fully segueing into the PlayStation, the PlayStation 2 games. I believe the first one was Dead Aim. Was it Dead Aim, or was there? Excuse me, except Code Veronica. After Code Veronica, the PlayStation 2
Yeah,
spin-off. I know there was Survivor 2 somewhere in there.
Yeah, Survivor 2 was a port from the arcade hardware. So yeah, Dead Aim would be the first completely original Resident Evil game on PlayStation 2, and I think had it had a bigger budget, I think it actually, and maybe a more connected storyline to the original to the main series. I think it would have been very successful because I actually really enjoyed Dead Aim. I thought
it's actually pretty to look at.
Very well made.
Pretty to look at. And
yeah,
I like the way it feels.
The graphics were great. If they didn't tie that to the whole GunCon idea, I think we could have seen a remaster of it by now.
Oof.
Yeah,
so do you think was that in mind? Was it the GunCon? Was it built with the GunCon in mind, or was it just Namco? I've got this really cool accessory that we used on Survivor. We should use it again. So it was actually built with that in mind.
Well, the Dead Aim was known as Gun Survivor 4 in Japan.
Yeah.
So
okay.
For whatever reason, Capcom really pushed the Gun Survivor series for a few years. It's really fascinating to see. But yeah, that was just a spin-off. I mean, I guess partly to fill the lineup and to keep releasing games, and I guess at that point to make up for the fact that Resident Evil 4 had moved off the platform. Although that was more Outbreaks kind of thing, but yeah.
I wonder if that was also a stray away from the actual fixed camera angles and stuff like that they were doing with 4, because like you said, Resident Evil 0 kind of like tarnished that for them.
Well, Dead Aim came out just a few months after 0, so there would be no correlation between the direction. I think Dead Aim is what it is because Resident Evil Survivor 1 and Survivor 2 were very they reviewed poorly, and Resident Evil Survivor was definitely the first Resident Evil game where feedback was nearly universally bad, right? And I think they realized, we can't keep doing these first-person only Resident Evil games. They're not going to be good. And as we see, they never went back in that direction until Resident Evil 7, right? The Chronicles games were around, but those were like arcade style.
Those are just rail shooters for a console release. That's really all they were.
Exactly. So I think that's why Dead Aim kind of went back to the more traditional third-person viewpoint for exploration, but they decided to keep the GunCon around, and that's why they made the combat first person, which I think actually works pretty well. So I actually want to revisit the game at some point because I just bought a CRT, so I can start using the GunCon again if I really wanted to. So
lovely. That's fantastic. So now we're entering Resident Evil Outbreak territory now. So they returned back to the fixed camera angles, but they had this new technological advancement they had to work with, which of course was the online component, which I feel looking back now was probably a little bit too early to release a game of that magnitude. What's your thoughts?
Maybe, yeah. I guess for Westerners, it might seem a bit early because maybe internet speeds weren't really very well developed. But actually, Japan's always been kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to internet connections. They had broadband a lot earlier than they did in the West. So as far as Japan was concerned, I think they felt they were ready, at least technologically. And in my personal experience, connection issues with the Outbreak games were much less common in Japan than they were elsewhere. So I think originally Mikami was supposed to do the Outbreak games, but then he was too busy with Resident Evil 4, so he handed off a lot of the production duties to actually a very significant guy in Capcom history, Noritaka Funamizu. He was one of the earliest members of Capcom. He had been there since the 80s, and a lot of his work was in the arcade division, where he supervised a lot of the success for Street Fighter 2. So he decided to take over the Resident Evil Outbreak production duties over at Capcom Production Studio 1. And they decided to keep a lot of the framework from Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 in terms of the style of gameplay. They were going to up the action a little bit, and they wanted to have the multiplayer aspect to it. And I think the biggest motivation for multiplayer Resident Evil was the fact that Capcom was the company that was known for Street Fighter. And so they had a lot of success in multiplayer social, not social game as we understand it today, but games where players interact with one another. The Resident Evil series had been very much one player focused. And I think a lot of the other big games that had, exactly. And I think a lot of the other big games that had come out, like Devil May Cry, Onimusha, Dino Crisis, Ace Attorney at that point as well, they were all one-player experiences. So I think Capcom was very much committed to trying to figure out how to get back to its roots as a multiplayer-focused game company. So online was the best way to do this. I think just for that note, Monster Hunter was the other big game that they were making with a multiplayer focus, and that was in development at the same studio. So Resident Evil Outbreak and the first Monster Hunter used the same engine.
What? Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, the engines that were in use at the other teams weren't necessarily in use at another team. So Production Studio 1 had their own engine that used that Devil May Cry 2, Devil May Cry 3, Resident Evil Outbreak, and Monster Hunter, I believe.
I could definitely see that. That is insane. That is crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, that was kind of their Capcom's team dedicated to multiplayer titles. And I think they had a few fighting games in development here as well. So
now, did you ever partake in Outbreak in its heyday?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I sank so many hours into
really?
it. I was never a great player. And I think part of the reason why was I kept choosing Yoko because she had more items. And
but that's why.
That's still why I play it to this day.
Yeah, that's who Andy means. I never got to experience the online as a kid. I got Outbreak on the PS2 late when the PS2's life, where they had just shut down Metal Gear Solid 3 servers and stuff like that, and. I had gotten it. I got Outbreak File 1, and it blew my mind every time seeing that when I started the game, network play. And it just blew my mind. I've never experienced Resident Evil as a multiplayer campaign ever. And now as an adult, and I'm doing it now, and I am absolutely having the time of my life. I love it. I love Outbreak with friends. Yeah. It's so much fun. I love it.
Right.
And it's also hard. And it's also really hard.
It's worth noting.
Yeah, it's really... Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, just on that point, it was really worth noting that Resident Evil Outbreak launched in the UK without any in the PAL regions, just with no PAL, online support whatever. So it's not even an option in the start screen. There's no references to online. So we played it as a single player experience. So now that I have the opportunity now with the private servers, which have now got through the emulation using the Observe private server network, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And what are your thoughts on bringing this back as even as a PS2 classics on PlayStation 4 or something like that? Well, I wouldn't say a remake, but maybe even if they bring it back just for a little, just with online support, of course.
I mean, I would like for them to do that personally, but I do recognize there are a lot of challenges involved in making that happen. A lot of the net code is most certainly outdated. There's no built-in chat functionality, which was a huge problem back in 2003 when people back then, back in 2003, 2004, people in the US at least were still calling each other on their cell phones and, racking up, charges per minute.
Oh,
I think Skype was already around back then, but the idea of calling someone over the internet for free was still very much nascent. And so a lot of the best methods of staying in touch during the game was via AOL Instant Messenger or MSN Messenger. If people remember these these things. I don't know how old you guys are, but those are my first forms of social interaction on the internet before Facebook and
how
whatnot.
susceptible? I mean, how could you? Did everyone have I don't think anyone had the ability to actually have both their computer and then their PS2 right next to them to say what they're doing. So they had to do what the I don't know what the system's actually called, where you have to
the ad-lib system, is it? Where
Yeah,
it's like you
ad-lib system.
Yeah.
Actually, can you hold on 1 second? I think my mailman's here. Sorry. 1 sec.
Yeah, no problem.
But
Yeah, so this is a really interesting concept. So
So
we actually we went from single player Resident Evil into multiplayer Resident Evil. And for me, I don't know about you, Matt, but it was very much I feel like it was too early. I really
it was ahead of its time. It was 100%. I mean, I didn't think online Resident Evil was even capable. I didn't know the PS2 went online with servers until late into its PS2 life. I didn't even know that was a thing. And I think it was definitely early. Like now, if this came out now with obviously with promoted, with dedicated servers for it and everything, I think it would do fantastic.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think there need to be a lot of technical tweaks, particularly with the loading times, and I think the game has choke points in certain parts. Choke points where, like, I think if I can't remember, but there would be certain points where you can't finish the game because either the AI screwed up,
soft locks,
or like you were soft locks. Yeah, exactly, or like a player got disconnected and didn't leave the item behind.
That happened to me the other day.
Right.
That happened to me the other day because you know how I'm sure there's already there's an online server base for fans to play the game online.
I've used it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was playing more with our buddy Nick, and he just disconnects, and he has the T blood. Like or whatever it was, or the P base, and I couldn't grab it, and so I'm sitting here. My affection's at 96. I'm about to go Zomboy, and I don't know what to do. So yeah, and,
that could happen, and unfortunately, fixing that is probably commensurate to the budget of a mid-level game these days, right? You can't just fix the code. You have to actually redo it. Right.
Yeah. And we all know that Capcom throws all their stuff out the window once they're done with it. Basically, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine they can probably port it if they wanted to. They've ported a lot of games from that era, but I mean, and it's not unheard of for them to go back to a PlayStation 2 game and fix it up. Like, I think the Onimusha remaster had new voice acting and new music in it, so they can do it. But
I didn't even know that.
It probably has. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there are really enough Outbreak fans out there who care so much that they can make this into a commercially viable game without Capcom having to, pour in the marketing resources for it. They'd have to do a lot of different things to it that I don't know if it would be trivial, right? So if it wouldn't be trivial, so I don't know, but I mean, I just want to pour in one anecdote, and the reason why there's no voice chat in the game or even like typing chat was because in Japan, where the game was made, there's a higher sense and a higher bar for privacy than there is in the West. So I think a lot of the big Capcom just didn't realize at the time how important communication was for online games, and the Xbox wasn't a big platform here, so a lot of the innovations that Xbox Live brought to the field were they kind of flew over Capcom's heads in a lot of ways. So and the reason is, again, it's a lot has to do with privacy, right? And there's a prevailing expectation in Japanese society to maintain privacy. Like, if you go to a Japanese arcade, you'll see that like an arcade cabinet, the two of them face each other, so the players don't see each other, rather than in the West where they're next to each other. And I think a lot of that carried over into the Outbreak, into Resident Evil Outbreak, and how it doesn't have voice chat, even in the second game, right? The expansion. So I think that was kind of a harsh lesson for them in regards to, you need voice chat when you're playing an online game.
Yeah.
Like the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live offer that. So when Resident Evil 5 showed up, that wasn't necessarily a problem. But yeah.
So it wasn't that they was technologically limited, because I'm sure there were games that had voice chat. Didn't SOCOM have voice chat?
Yeah, Western game.
Yeah.
Oh,
So-
that go. Yeah, good
So that
point.
kind of
Yeah,
makes sense, because I always thought in my head, only until you've started to explain it now, that it was a technological thing is why they couldn't include it. But if it's more of a cultural thing, that totally makes sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think things have changed in Japan, and now there will be very few games that don't offer any sort of communication feature, but that's all built into the hardware's infrastructure. The PlayStation 2 was a bit of a Wild West kind of situation when it came to online gameplay. So, we take PlayStation Network and Xbox Live for granted today in 2020, but back then it was really only the Xbox that offered a cohesive online infrastructure that you had to pay for every month. And that was still kind of a new thing back then. In the West, I think Resident Evil Outbreak was free to play online, but in Japan, there was a monthly fee. You had to pay for it, around $7 to $8 from what I remember. Yeah, and you had to subscribe to that service for Capcom games, but it wouldn't necessarily work with the service that you had to pay to play Final Fantasy XI, for example. And then there's also the hard drive that you had to buy to reduce the loading times. I'm personally of the opinion that Resident Evil Outbreak might have been more successful if it was an Xbox game. I think the fundamentals needed to make that game a technological powerhouse were more prevalent. Were present on the Xbox, and you wouldn't have to buy a lot of accessories to make that happen.
I think you're absolutely
I think
right.
it would have looked a bit better. It would have run smoother, but there was no market for the thing in Japan, so I think that was a non-starter for Capcom.
And it sucks because a game like that you want to play with friends, because I feel like there's a very few handful of people who've actually completed every single scenario of File 1 and 2 by themselves, let alone with friends, or vice versa. That game has so much content into both File 1 and 2.
Yeah, and we know that there's tons of unused areas and unused chapters and episodes that wasn't included in the final series.
Yeah, they conceptualized, I think, 20 or 30 scenarios early on. Only 10 of them were used at the end. So,
jeez. I feel like Outbreak's already a long game. Already, it's a very lengthy game. I'm still, Decisions is like the 4th scenario. Oh my god, that scenario alone takes me like 3 hours.
Oh, agreed.
Yeah, it's sad how it's longer than Resident Evil 3 Remake.
So,
fascinatingly though. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, the floor's yours.
Please go ahead.
You're right.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Sorry, I keep going on.
Please go ahead, please.
The first Resident Evil Outbreak was definitely a success for Capcom in terms of sales. Like, it actually outsold the GameCube games, which was pretty remarkable because this was a spin-off, right? And there was a relatively high barrier to entry, but Outbreak did sell better than. It sold better than Code Veronica on single platforms. It sold better than Zero. It sold better than Remake.
Really?
The problem is when the second game came out and they hardly made improvements to it that people were asking for. I think that pretty much spelled the end for the franchise. And one thing that people don't really know, that's not really like common knowledge, was that there was initially a plan for Capcom to port Resident Evil Outbreak to PlayStation Portable, PSP.
Really?
Is this the Resident Evil Portable that was announced in 2010? Or is that different?
No, that's a different thing. That eventually became Resident Evil Revelations.
Understood.
Really?
People knew that, right?
I didn't know that either.
Did you know? No.
No. See, the thing. The
It
only
makes
thing we
sense
got,
now.
the only thing we only got was
Uh,
Resident Evil's coming to the PSP, and it was a PNG and a PSP PNG in front of it, and it had Resident Evil in front of it, and that's all we got. You know,
I remember. Yeah, it eventually became Revelations, but there was they wanted to bring Resident Evil Outbreak to PSP, and that was initially the plan, but I think File 2 underperformed when it came out. And
how long after
they
did File 2
decided,
come out?
like 9 months after in Japan.
Okay.
And didn't sell very well. Resident Evil 4, meanwhile, did so well around the same time, and people were totally sold on the new Resident Evil viewpoint. So I think they just pulled the plug on the fixed camera Resident Evils after File 2. Like, if zero was the beginning of the end.
Outbreak.
File 2 was pretty much the end of it. They did port Resident Evil 1 to DS, but that wasn't really a major thing. And then they ended up passing on Resident Evil Outbreak on PSP in favor of Monster Hunter on PSP. Because
I remember that.
both on the same team. And Monster Hunter became Capcom's biggest franchise eventually.
Yep.
So
it did. Try was crazy. That's weird that you say that.
These decisions, yeah.
It's funny that you say that Revelations was originally on the PSP, because we originally got the Revelations that we did get came out on the 3DS, which is also a portable system.
Yeah,
I
didn't make the connection then, but it totally makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense now. That's very interesting. I wonder why that the portable, that title was so it had to be on a portable system, which is weird because it was eventually ported to mainline consoles.
Yeah,
like,
you don't normally see that.
Right.
It's ported.
Right.
It's ported from the portable to the bigger
handheld
console.
to
Revelations
console.
is such a console worthy. I'd like to say that, use that word loosely. Console worthy game. When it came out for the 3DS, it was absolutely fantastic, and it brought it. Not to skip over 5 and 6 or whatever, but it brought us back to survival horror, and I think it was a precursor to 7.
Well, I think it kind of
absolutely same director. Yeah, same director. So Revelations and 7 have the flashback sequences, and they jump around in time a bit. That's all the work of the director Nakanishi-san. So,
and we're
jumping ahead, but he had what?
No, I was going to ask if did he have any say in 5, because we don't really have that in 5, but we have Lost in Nightmares, but it's totally different content from the main line, so probably not, right?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think when I say flashbacks, I mean you're within the main game. You are jumping back and forth, right? Like the Mia flashbacks and the tapes. And
I enjoyed Revelations.
Story jumping.
A lot of characters in Revelations. A lot of new characters in Revelations. Kind of
funny characters. I would say.
Really, just experimental characters, really.
Which I like. This
point,
Capcom was never shy with characters. They make great concept for characters, and I love more Resident Evil characters like that. So I love that.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. But to go back to the PlayStation Portable thing, I don't think Revelations in and of itself was ever going to come to PSP. I just think the Resident Evil Portable project eventually transitioned into Revelations for the 3DS. And I think it was canceled for PSP because of political reasons. Political as in like, well, I mean, I think I can't get into too much detail, but there were reasons that Capcom decided to support the Nintendo handheld instead of the PlayStation.
Understood.
And that would say was for the better, because by the time Resident Evil Revelations came out, the PSP was pretty much done.
Yeah,
and the Vita never became a big thing, so I think they made the right choice there.
Yeah, I think they did too. Which, and if you ask me, well, I think Revelations really kick-started the 3DS. To be quite honest.
Yeah, it was a glorious title. Just rewinding a little bit. There was another kind of sub-series inside of Resident Evil, which was the Chronicles series. I just want to quickly cover that. I appreciate this has been. I did say I didn't want this to be 3 hours long, but this has been.
It's a great part. This is
absolutely fantastic.
Up to you. Up to you.
I feel like, yeah, I just don't want to, you know, I want to try and cover everything, but I don't want to use up all of your time. But if we could cover the Chronicles quickly, we know that Capcom liked the idea of House of the Dead from the Survivor series. Survivor series, that's weird way of saying.
Exactly.
From Survivor. Why did they then revisit it again for the Wii with the Chronicles series?
Well, the Wii remote just made sense, right?
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Every Wii owner owns a Wii remote, so there's no barrier to entry. You don't need anything other than the Wii's sensor bar. You point the remote and you shoot. So it's
Right.
fundamentally very simple, and it was the same development team as Dead Aim. So Kavia, I think Kavia made the Nier games as well. So,
Autonomous?
not Autonoma. They made the first Nier games.
Okay.
From what I remember. So they're a pretty good development team, and you can tell with the visuals of the Chronicles games that they were definitely very capable. But yeah, Resident Evil on the Wii, basically, this was the first instance of a power diversion between systems within the same generation. So the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were HD-focused consoles with a clear graphical leap over the Wii and the previous generation. But for Nintendo, they realized with the GameCube that they just weren't able to really compete on the same level if they were going to maintain a technologically competitive console. So they decided to go with the different idea, with the new controls and the underpowered hardware. And
were they concerned at all with how well this would sell in Western audiences?
Yeah, that's why the budget. I mean, the budget. It's a pretty low budget, right? If you look at Umbrella Chronicles, like it's a good looking game, but like the voice acting and the cutscenes are very funky, right? They were definitely a bit of a regression compared to Resident Evil 4. And like they obviously cheated with the Resident Evil 3 chapter as well. So a lot of well used assets.
They skimmed over that very, very quickly.
They're like, they're like Resident Evil 3. Yeah. Anyway, did you see this nice new OG story content that we have? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. With the 0 and 1 chapters, they just took the assets from the GameCube games, and they
didn't they? But
lowered the fidelity and.
I was just going to say they did. Yeah. What I do appreciate is they did make it fully 3D.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they had to. But I mean, those assets were originally 3D. It's just that they made them into videos in order for them to be pre-rendered. But I think those files were still around, and they were able to take those the polygonal mesh models and then just downgrade them to run on the Wii. And that saved them a lot of time on the development end, and they kept all like the same character models. So, yeah, it was a Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles was made as a budget experimental title to see how Resident Evil as a franchise would do on the Wii. And ironically, it was thanks to Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition that Capcom soon found out that there was definitely an audience for Resident Evil games on the Wii. So they
eventually ported 0, correct, right?
Yeah, port is a generous word because it's the same hardware. So they literally just did a
control support.
Like exactly. Like in the modern day, you could patch that into a game, right?
Yeah.
Back then, you'd have to re-release it. But yeah, and then they made Darkside Chronicles, which if you look at the production values of that game, are far higher. So.
Yeah, I was about to ask you. Now that was the same team, right?
Yes.
Why did they? What was such a difference in production? Like, obviously there was a bigger budget, right? Why? What happened there? I don't understand. Like, whereas we got two Code Veronica and this new story, all pertaining to Leon and Claire, where it was definitely more high value. I wonder. Where the direction was for when it came to Umbrella Chronicles dividing from where it became Darkside Chronicles.
Well, yeah, Umbrella Chronicles sold much better than anybody expected it to, and so did Resident Evil 4, and that's why they decided to pour more resources into Darkside Chronicles. Apparently, someone on the team was also a big fan of the movie Cloverfield with the whole
That totally
shot
makes
footage
sense.
and the whole shaking and the
Yeah.
Warzone elements. So yeah, that you can easily tell. Like I think Dark Side Chronicles looks fantastic.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
God.
it does. And a million times better.
Like it looks better than Resident Evil 4. You know, and in my viewpoint,
I
and
could say,
even the
yeah,
code,
I would say that.
like the Code Veronica chapter, even though the Wii is, I guess, technically in the same like technological generation as the Dreamcast, it's definitely a step up, right? And I
Agreed.
really
Yeah, oh,
like how the
yeah.
game looks, and I think this. It's a shame that the original chapter wasn't a Resident Evil 4 style entry. I think if Operation Javier were like a spin-off that played like Resident Evil 4 and the whole game focused on that, it would have been a pretty good game. Like Revelations before Revelations was a thing, really.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, how did you feel about Operation Javier? It kind of bridged a gap between Code Veronica and 4, and well, 2 and 4 really.
Mm.
They gave Krauser a backstory as well.
Yeah, and they gave Krauser a
Right.
backstory because whereas, like, if we backtrack a little bit, you remember when we were talking about how Leon, last time we saw Leon, he was a rookie cop here. And then next we see him, he's an agent for the government, and all of a sudden there's this Krauser guy, and they have a past that we don't know about. So there was a lot of plot holes, and I think like they obviously it's because of they've redone it so many times. But I like how they tried to bridge that gap, and it was a really cool story how they intertwined that with 4 with Code Veronica with the T Veronica virus. I really would like to know your opinion on
Underappreciated.
Yeah, I would
Yeah,
like to
I
know
would
your
s-
opinion about that whole operation.
Yeah, I would say this was the better fill-in scenario than the one in Umbrella Chronicles, right? The one in Umbrella Chronicles just seems so nonsensical in a lot of ways, and
It was still kind of cool.
even though it answered the question of how Umbrella got taken down.
Yeah.
I didn't find it very imaginative,
No.
Yeah.
right? Whereas Operation Javier was obviously a lot more in depth, and even though Krauser's backstory is a minor thing, I do like the treatment that they gave it. Whereas with Umbrella Chronicles, it was like, oh, Umbrella went down because they invaded a base and killed a monster, right?
Yeah.
So
Remember
you know,
Chris?
they-
Remember Jill?
remember
Remember
Chris,
those
remember
guys?
Jill, remember Wesker? Yeah.
Yeah.
They were actually busy. But it doesn't really matter what. It matters less what they were doing. Just the end result is what it is, right?
You're right. But I thought it was
the
really cool
segue-
that we got that Wesker a revival scenario where it shows him actually escaping. I thought that was super cool. Like I said, I'm a lore junkie, and I was like, oh, I wonder how Wesker got out. The mansion exploded, and you just see he gets up and he just starts. He's like, oh, my body, it's more powerful, and he's talking about how the virus is starting to course through his veins and stuff like that, which I thought was really cool. Which is also why I liked Operation Javier.
Yeah, I think with Umbrella Chronicles, all those behind the scenes scenarios were really cool. Like the one that's Wesker, the one where you play as Rebecca between 0 and 1, and
that's
Ada's
right.
scenario as
I
well.
forgot about that
Those
one,
were
too.
the good ones.
I
Those
forgot
were the
about that
great
one, yeah.
ones. The actual Invade Umbrella was very even though it's the invasion of the Umbrella headquarters, it felt like a generic, Outbreak kind of thing. Not Resident Evil Outbreak, but like just zombie Outbreak. Go kill a bunch of monsters and you're done. Right?
It was very also very movie-esque, if I'm using that term right. I felt like I was maybe like watching someone's movie adaptation of what could have happened. It was very action, I feel like that could have been like almost like a scenario in itself. In a good, like a good, kind of like a good Revelations kind of sort of game of the downfall of Umbrella, which obviously missed opportunities go with that, go without being said with Capcom and Resident Evil for that matter. So,
yeah, I would love for them to go back to those storylines and just make third-person games out of them with full storylines.
Could you imagine?
Right, and actual character interaction.
Fanboy's dream right there.
If you think about it, I mean, if you see how Resident Evil 1, 0, 2, they all got abridged, right? Or it's 1, 0, 3 rather, 0, 1, 3. A lot is missing, right? So I can only imagine what really happened in those scenarios.
Oh yeah,
is also abridged to an extent, and I would love to see them kind of
Oh, flesh it out, yeah.
flesh them out.
Which is kind
exactly.
of cool. Which is kind of cool because with the SD Perry novels, she definitely tries to, or tried to do that. It's unfortunate that the games were in development coinciding with the writing of the novel, so it doesn't always match. So like,
Yeah.
and lore junkies go crazy. Well, this happened in this here, okay, but in the book it says this. So it's just, when it comes to lore though, you will get lost forever. So.
Yeah, the books are their own thing, and
Mhm.
you can't write a book that approximates every Resident Evil game down to a T, right? 'Cause that would be a very boring book to read, I would say. So I think she changed things around out of necessity, and I think SD Perry made stuff that was entertaining for me to read, even if it's not exactly the same. I mean,
especially
it's not
like,
supposed to. Right?
yeah, and then like making Billy have a connection with Chris was kind of cool in the novel. Just little stuff like that, which is why I think Operation Javier would have been a great standalone game.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it has a more interesting story and a more interesting premise than the Revelations games, even. So it's.
Oh, I would say that. I would say that most definitely. You're tying in almost 3 games right there, 2 games right there. Yeah, Code Veronica 4, and then what would later become, I guess, part of the crazy virus that comes too.
Oh, agreed.
Right.
Agreed. So we're now at a point we've gone through the Dark Side Chronicles, which is effectively just a retelling of the previous games. We're now entering, I believe, to be 5 and 6. So what was this is probably going to be after what's detailed in the Itchy Tasty book, but from a fan's point of view, what was your feeling towards 5 and 6? And obviously it borrowing a lot of elements from Resident Evil 4, but then just going whole hog into full on action. What was your thoughts?
Can we take a quick bathroom break?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah, no problem at all. No problem.
I apologize. Yeah,
that's okay. That's okay.
Like 2 hours in.
Yeah. No, we're very grateful.
I will be back in a minute or 2.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Sorry.
So while we're doing that, guys, we're just going to talk about the man himself, Alex Aniel, who's joined us today for a special episode of the Biohazard Declassified podcast. Alex is he's written a book. He lives in Japan and he chronicalizes the development process.
I'm gonna hit the tank too, Andy.
Yeah, no problem. Of the development cycle of Resident Evil from 1996 to around 2005, 2006. So if you're an OG fan and you love the original content, I would definitely recommend supporting it. I've got a link to the book in the comment section there. I've got it as a pinned comment. If you want to support Alex's book, Alex has been a prominent member of the Resident Evil community for over 20 years now, and this book will absolutely blow your mind. The stuff I'm hearing today is absolutely fantastic. We're getting interesting gen into the original Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 development. Capcom working on what seems to be about 15 Resident Evil games at once. When you had Resident Evil Survivor, Resident Evil Code Veronica, then they were bringing them all to the GameCube, then they were bringing them to the N64, then they decided to cancel the N64 port, and then they brought it out on the GameCube. Absolutely fantastic stuff. Alex is in a very special position where he lives in Osaka. He speaks fluent Japanese and has an unreal connection to the developers of the original Resident Evil. So we're grateful for his time today. But please jump on over to his link. I see a couple of you guys in the comment section who's watching the live feed have actually we've got another 2 supporters on Alex's campaign here. So please jump on over to Alex's Unbounded link and let's get this book funded, and let's get this funded because this is super awesome gen and one in a million information. So let's just bring you back in here.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. Thanks for your patience, and thank you for the 2 new backers. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the book is definitely happening now because we hit the funding goal back in December, but I really can't wait for this to come out. Unfortunately, because of everything that's been going on around the world with COVID-19, it did slip into 2021, and I really do apologize for that. But hopefully, we'll be in a better place next year. And
agreed.
I can't wait till everybody reads it. I think one of the biggest problems that I actually am having with this book is that there's a signed edition, but I actually have to fly to the UK for that. And very few people are flying right now. So
Yes,
I
yes,
wouldn't wish.
yes.
I wouldn't recommend wouldn't wish flying to UK on my worst enemy. No, but that's glorious, and yeah, obviously this is an unprecedented book. It's not. We briefly spoke about it earlier about how it's going to be. It's not a novel or anything like that. It's a completely non-fiction, pure developmental process breakdown of the Resident Evil games. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, we've actually
I think it's
passed
really cool.
the end point of the book. The Wii stuff isn't actually in there. So
Yeah, no, that's cool. But it's I figured that was the case. Well, hence why I kind of prefaced it. But it's good to know that it's good to get your thoughts on it. And you know, we're going to start moving towards the new Resident Evils, which I do want to talk about. I'm not sure how much time we've got left, but I'd love to talk about them too. But yeah, so we was picking up on Resident Evil 5 and 6. We just covered them broad brush. What was your thoughts behind that? And do you have any sort of anecdotes around that?
Yeah, the next 10 years of Resident Evil development, from I guess up until the release of 7, between 4 and 7, I don't actually think a lot of super interesting things took place to the degree that they did in the first 10 years, right? The first 10 years of Resident Evil was them trying to find their footing and seeing what works and how to deal with what happened when the franchise sank in popularity for a while. Whereas the following decade, the series' popularity was a lot more consistent and it grew a lot. And I would say, yeah, Resident Evil 5 was a fine game. I don't think it was as good as 4, but I do think that it made Resident Evil into a credible multiplayer franchise, and I do think people still enjoy the game today. It was the first HD game, the first game in the series where the production values were truly out there.
Can I ask you why you don't like it as much as 4? I don't mean to cut you off. I really got to know.
I just don't think that a lot of the set pieces are as interesting as what they did in 4, and a lot of them are modeled after Resident Evil 4, right? Like some of the enemies and some of the situations, like shooting down the car that's going after you.
I totally know what you mean.
I think Resident Evil 4 gets points for originality and deliberate design. Like the pacing is absolutely phenomenal. And each situation, even though it might be materially similar to a situation from earlier in the game, there's enough about it that's different, like with the environments, right? Or whether you're with Ashley or not, that really mix things up a bit. Whereas Resident Evil 5 is just, it's very consistent from beginning to end. And there are times where I feel like Encounter A is far too similar to Encounter B. And I think the biggest change Resident Evil 5 throws at players in the later part of the game is like giving enemies guns, right? And focusing on the Gears of War style corner shooting mechanic. Is that what they call it in English?
It's
cover shooting mechanic, excuse me.
Yeah, and then like it kind of comes out of nowhere, and like so you don't really know that you can do it until it says, it gives you the command. You're like, oh, okay, cool, you know. But like, I also think that's kind of part of its charm. It's kind of like loose cannon charm. It's very reminiscent of PS3 action games. You're right. Whereas Resident 4 is definitely more original. Okay, I actually like that explanation a lot. That's the best explanation I've ever gotten.
It's not bad, but I mean, if you really look at the creativity behind Resident Evil 4 and all the influence that it's had, and you think about where gaming was in 2005 versus where gaming was in 2009, there were people who didn't think Resident Evil 5 was as good as Dead Space, right?
Yes, yeah, okay.
Whereas you will be hard pressed to find someone who can find a game like Resident Evil 4 and just as good as it, right? And I
Yeah.
recognize that today, even today, Resident Evil 4 is probably as a whole untopped, right? Certainly not
Agreed.
by 5. Maybe Resident Evil 2 remake gets to that point for some people, but it's still a very different game. So yeah, that was probably the biggest problem I had with 5. But it's a fun game. I really like the story. I really like the characters. The graphics still look very nice today. Especially if you play it on a Switch and you have the little.
Oh, I
small
love it. I
screen.
just got it.
It's
I just
really
got it for the
interesting.
Switch, and I'm all my nights before bed is just Resident Evil 5 Mercenaries, and they got it to where I think it's called Mercenaries Reunion or something.
Reunion.
Yeah, it's all
Or
of them.
United.
United. Yes,
United,
yes.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And they're all in there at one playable game. It's so awesome. It's really cool. I really like that. I think it really does well on a portable system. I think it's made well for it, to be quite honest.
Right. And it did take a while to make Resident Evil 5. It took about 4 years, but that's because Capcom was new to the HD scene at the time. And, they were still trying to figure out the MT framework idea that they inherited from Dead Rising and Lost Planet. But yeah, I would say it's a very successful game. Definitely the best-selling one in the series so far. And it's been selling for 10 years, which is pretty unusual for a lot of games, right? Most games have a shelf life of maybe 2 to 3 years. Capcom has managed to keep Resident Evil 5 very much relevant. Even the last gen versions still sell copies, every now and then. So I think it's
Capcom's best-selling game, right?
Well,
for a while there.
It was for a long time, and Monster Hunter World
completely just yeah.
But Monster Hunter is definitely a very different kind of beast. Like with Monster Hunter, everyone buys the same game. With Resident Evil, people buy different games because there's so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
So
how different was Resident Evil 5's beginning story to the one that we got? How much do you know about that?
Probably as well as most other people know. Capcom, had an art book that kind of detailed a lot of the original ideas that they had for Resident Evil 5. Like I think Jill was supposed to originally be playable at the end of the game.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Things like that. There were no dramatic changes that we saw with Resident Evil 4, and I think they stuck to the concept pretty consistently from beginning to end. They really upped the stake in the story, and they really wanted to continue from where Code Veronica left off. So
they were just going to completely just drop Sheva as a character in favor for Jill at the end?
Well, I think the original concept was Sheva would get kidnapped herself after they saved Jill, and Jill and Chris would go and save Sheva. But I think they abandoned that because they didn't want to do Sheva dirty, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right.
So yeah, I think all in all, a solid game. I think the only real production difficulty at the beginning of development was the director, because by this time Mikami was gone, right? Mikami and a lot of the other original Resident Evil creators were gone, so this served as kind of a clean break in a lot of ways. Mikami did choose a director for this game, but apparently he didn't have the chops to make it through the end. So they ended up changing the director to Ampo-san, Yasuhiro Ampo, and he eventually saw the project to completion. But I mean, other than that, there weren't really too many terrible things that happened with this game.
I love this game for what it is. It's one of my most favorite Resident Evil games, which is weird because I'm one of those fans on the spectrum where my favorite game is Resident Evil 1 Remake. I'm a diehard fan of the originals, but I also love 5 and 6, just for what they are. I can pick up 5 anywhere, any day of the time, and just have a blast for a whole hour.
Right. And I think it took a lot of people time for them to adjust to the direction that Resident Evil 5 had gone in. Because even though the gameplay was very similar to 4, there were a lot of departures to it in terms of the game structure and the whole emphasis on online and the lack of horror elements. And these were problems for people when it came out in 2009. But I think they kind of got used to it.
Yeah.
And I think seeing where Resident Evil 6 went allowed people to appreciate Resident Evil 5, because I like 6 enough, but 6 was definitely a problematic game in a lot of different ways, and I think Resident Evil 5 luckily didn't veer down that path, and I would say it's a very good example of maybe Capcom didn't shoot as high as they could in theory, but I don't see very many low points with it either. And it's a very successful game.
It's weird, whereas Original 6 has the same charm almost. Kind of.
RE6, I mean, I think as Resident Evil fans, you might like RE6 for different reasons, but I would say that it definitely has a tainted reputation.
Oh, big time. I would agree with you 100%.
For various reasons. The game has sold very well, and I think it's because it's a very mainstream kind of experience with emphasis on action, lots of explosions, very long game. But I think Resident Evil 6's biggest failure came from the lack of cohesive direction. I think Capcom stopped thinking about how to be original, and they were following the trends of the time that were being set by the Call of Duties and the Battlefields, the Gears titles that Western developers had made. And I think the project became so bloated and so unfocused, and the technical polish suffered for that in a lot of ways.
Bit of an identity crisis almost.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry, I just said it's a bit of an identity crisis. It just didn't know what it really wanted to be.
Absolutely. This, if Resident Evil 0 was a cause for alarm, Resident Evil 6 was, the ambulance, right?
Right.
Speeding down the highway, toward Capcom headquarters. But Resident Evil 6, even though it sold well enough, it didn't initially meet their expectations. The budget was pretty massive for the game, and I don't think Capcom made a penny on it for a while. So they have now, obviously.
Yeah.
But back then, it was definitely an underperforming title, and for Resident Evil 7, they were really wondering where they could go with the series. They knew they couldn't make another Resident Evil 6 game, even though I think that was the original intention. Like, they really wanted the Resident Evil 6 formula to stick, and they were going to go for it and make Jake kind of the central character in that direction.
Really?
But because the game performed so poorly on review sites, they decided to abandon those plans. So they kind of had to do a little bit of soul searching in order to find their direction, and Resident Evil 7 was one of those. But I think the reason why they were able to settle on the direction of Resident Evil 7 was because after RE6 came out, they released Revelations on HD systems, right? And
Sure.
Revelations was better received than Resident Evil 6 was. And I think after that, they also did the remaster of Resident Evil 1, and that also performed very well for Capcom. So the whole horror focus, the return to horror was Capcom's way of being able to stand out again and being able to follow its own path rather than trying to go after the Call of Duties and the Battlefields, right? That they couldn't possibly live up to themselves. But even with Resident Evil 7, they went with the first-person direction because they wanted to be anti-open world. They wanted the game to have a very specific focus. And the results from Revelations 1, Revelations 2, and Resident Evil Remake HD were very encouraging in terms of stepping away from the action focus that had been introduced with Resident Evil 4. But they still weren't sure if the Resident Evil first-person idea would catch on, because it was still kind of a stigma thanks to the Survivor series, right? And they weren't sure if it would be successful. So that's why when Resident Evil 2 Remake was greenlit, they decided to make it a very different game than 7, to kind of hedge their bets in case the first-person viewpoint was not very well received. Luckily, it was. So,
yeah, it's kind of interesting, the fact that Revelations, it took third-person, the over-the-shoulder perspective with the horror, and then they added the first-person when aiming. I wonder if that was somewhat a precursor to that. Like you said, it was the same director. So
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first person aiming was also partly because it was a 3DS game with a small screen. And
then that was the first game they actually implemented moving while aiming, I think, too, right?
In the main series, yes.
Yeah.
File 2 would have been the first game in general. But I think the 3DS also had gyro controls, so having a
Yes.
first-person option for that made a lot of sense in terms of how to make it a user-friendly experience. But like, I mean, Resident Evil 7, it drives the whole first-person element of the first-person idea home. And even though at a surface level, Resident Evil 7 might play similarly to Resident Evil 2, I would say the perspective does make a huge difference. So I'm really impressed and also very happy that Capcom has managed to find two different styles of Resident Evil that work very well.
Yeah.
And it's like the Mario series, right? You have your 2D Mario, you have the two different styles of 3D Mario. You have like the Odyssey style and the 3D Land, 3D World style. And Capcom has managed to make that work for Resident Evil as well, which is a good thing. I think the only question now is whether action Resident Evil really has a future, and I would imagine the remake of 4 that's been long rumored is probably going to be a testament to whether it is or not. I think Resident Evil 3 remake kind of went in that direction as well.
I thought Resident Evil 3 remake kind of like tried to dip its foot in that already. Kind of like was because we already know that the OG Resident Evil 3 was already kind of action oriented, and now they just kind of implemented that into a modern setting. And I wonder if the way they're going to do it now will execute better than what they did from 5. But it's also interesting to think in the fact that 5 did so well that it even garnered its own spin-off on the 3DS, Mercenaries 3D. But that's just a mini game of sorts, so I guess it's not really comparable in which that you could use that. I think Resident Evil 3 really works well as an action-oriented game.
It does, yeah. It's just a bit short, right? And I don't think there's a lot of originality in it, unlike Resident Evil 2 remake. So I think those are the biggest problems with 3. But I do think that they are trying to inch back toward an action offering, and if they can successfully do that, then that'll be 3 viable directions for the Resident Evil franchise, which I think is unprecedented. You know, there have been multiple Resident Evil styles in movement at the same time in the past, but usually one success came at the expense of the other. Like I think Resident Evil 4 success destroyed any chance of Outbreak File 2, right?
Yeah.
Finding a market for itself. But now we've got Village coming up. That's a first-person game, and you know there are some people who are unhappy with that, but I think there are other people who are really going to be into it, especially as a next-gen game. And you know, Resident Evil 2 was a phenomenal title that finally, without caveats, merged the original Resident Evil flavor with the over-the-shoulder viewpoint.
Yeah, and I think it did what Revelations did fucking beautifully. You know, it was really great. I think Resident Evil 2 is a complete and utter definition of a good remake.
Totally.
As a whole, Alex, what did you think of the return to Raccoon City, like Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake together as a package? I know you liked Resident Evil 3, but Resident Evil 2, but yeah, what was your thoughts on that? I
cannot sing enough praise for Resident Evil 2, especially after Resident Evil 3 came out and we saw what else they could have done had they not stuck to the material much closer. But 2 is a masterpiece, and I think my biggest complaint would be the lack of variety between the different scenarios, but forgivable. Like the level design, the progression, the pacing, and Resident Evil 2 are just excellent, and I am really glad that Capcom was able to settle on a direction for that title that just worked so well. And you know, even though there are a lot of differences between the remake and the original, and a few things were missing, like the spiders and the moths and the crows.
But did you miss them?
All for the better. I mean, not necessarily. No.
Yeah, I would have liked to see the Black Tiger Spider BOWs in the new RE engine. Don't get me wrong, I didn't miss them. You know, that's how I feel.
Me neither.
Yeah, that's how. That's kind of like the Resident Evil 3 with the whole Gravedigger thing.
I mean, it would have been nice to have, but I'm not losing sweat over it. Like the things they took out of 3 were a problem in a lot of ways, but not necessarily with 2, I would say. So I don't know how you guys feel.
I actually I enjoy 3 remake a lot actually, because as I didn't beat OG 3 until later, like early in my young adult years. I just think that the remake 3 is actually a better version of OG 3. Yeah, I do miss Clock. I think the Clock Tower version of in the RE engine could have been fantastic. It would have been the game longer too. That's the only gripe I really have. It's not long enough.
Yeah, I mean, the gameplay's fine. I mean, it's based off of the framework established with Resident Evil 2. So in that sense, there's a good foundation there. But I wasn't a fan of the lack of puzzles and
yeah, I would agree with that.
And
I would agree with
the lack of variety from playthrough to playthrough. Like if they had just added these small elements that made the original RE3 so unique, then I think it would have turned out better, right? I mean, there's little about Resident Evil 3 that could make it as good as Resident Evil 2, in my opinion. But I think they missed the opportunity to elevate the 3rd game in the context of the whole series, right? The original game kind of got overshadowed by Code Veronica, and it was never as good as RE2. That's fine, right? It wasn't supposed to be. This game, 20 years later, they still stuck to that framework of, kind of selling the 3rd game short, and I don't think it's as forgivable this time around, right? Nobody told Capcom they had to release another Resident Evil game 14 months later, right? So
right, and then it basically wasn't even like they were releasing 3 remake. It was like, hey, we also got you see this is Resistance, that's all it really was. It was a ploy for Resistance to come out.
That's a flawless segue. Actually, you're wearing a Project Resistance shirt.
I was about to say that. Yeah.
What do you think of Resident Evil Resistance?
I don't know if you can see, but it says staff on
cool.
Yeah, this was a gift from a friend of mine at Capcom, so I thought
that's really cool.
Apt to wear this to the podcast. I mean, obviously the name changed. I actually I haven't played much of Resistance because it's always changing, and I want to get into the game when things kind of stabilize.
Yeah,
I'm also pretty bad at it.
It's a hard game. It's
a hard game.
Yeah,
it's very stressful to play.
Especially if you don't have a good team. I've been playing it nonstop for about the past month and a half now. I want the game to do well. I am a big advocate for an online Resident Evil game. I loved Mercenaries 5 online. I absolutely loved it. And I like how the servers and stuff are still open for these games still. I think a Resident Evil online game can do well. Outbreak is obviously a precursor to that. And
yeah, there's a lot of inspiration there for sure.
It's super, and a lot of people are mad that they didn't just get an Outbreak remake, but what are you gonna do? Resident Evil 3 and that whole release was just a whole lot of missed opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's it's the next evolution in multiplayer gaming. This kind of 4 versus 1 asymmetric multiplayer. So it was inevitable that we was going to get something like this. But from go on.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, I really like the concept, and I think
I like it a lot.
I would like Resident Evil to have its own version of Mario Maker, where we can make like the environment, and we can set the items wherever we want, without the added stress of having to do it in real time, right? Like I think if I could spend an hour designing my own Resident Evil game, like that would make a kick-ass
that would be pretty
extra
cool.
mode.
That would be pretty cool.
Resistance does have the fundamental, does have the base for Capcom to eventually make that happen. So you choose your own character, you choose your own costumes, designs, whatever, and I think it'd be fun, right?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. 100%. It's there's a lot of confusion in the Resistance community right now. Whereas they don't know if they like all those nuances where you can make the survivors struggle. So and like whereas if you can make your own, you're making yourself struggle and you like it a lot because like, oh crap, like I can't get past these 3 zombies I put here. The game's rather broken sometimes.
Yeah,
I'm being quite honest.
I think it's partly the online connection. There's a lot of latency.
There's no dedicated servers. There's
no dedicated servers.
You have to rely on the mastermind's connection, which is really bad in itself because like that masterminds have found ways to essentially break the game for survivors. So, but again, it's a growing game. It's a growing game. And like I said, I think Resident Evil Online can do really well. It's in execution.
Yeah, it's an outsourced game as well. So I think there's only so much that team can do, not being an internal Capcom team, from what I imagine. So I think I really respect what NeoBards, the Taiwanese developer, set out to do, and I really think that they've worked very hard, and I'm impressed with their post-launch commitment to making sure that the game stays relevant.
I think
Resident Evil Village has been announced. Yeah, Village got announced, and I felt like that could have been an opportunity for Capcom to forget about the game, but luckily they haven't. Because if you look at Umbrella Corps, right? That had like 2 months of support, and then just pulled the plug entirely. And I'm glad they didn't do that again this time, because that would have been really bad.
That's a nice segue. That's a really nice segue, because I'm going to do a bit of a picture association here. So what was your thoughts? I always do this with all of my guests, because of the recent
Sure.
What was your thoughts? You saw this man.
Oh, that's actually my wallpaper. Maybe I can minimize this window. That's actually I really love this render. Share screen.
Can we do that?
I gotta allow this. Well, I can. I just have to I have to permit it on. No, never mind. It won't let me because it's a security setting. But that's actually my wallpaper.
So you're a
screenshot.
You're a Redfield fan?
Actually, no, I'm not. People have gotten mad at me past for trolling on Twitter, but I actually much prefer Leon and Jill over the Redfields.
Really?
For a myriad of reasons, and those two are definitely the most popular characters. So I think maybe that might be part of the reason why. But I do like Leon and Jill better. I do like the games they appear in better than that the Redfields appear in.
Really?
Oh.
It's so weird.
Yeah.
I'm actually quite the opposite. I'm 100% for the games that the Redfields appear in, but not as huge
Code
fan.
Veronica is still one of my favorites, so it's not like I dislike them. I just don't prefer them as much as I do the other two characters.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean that's the beauty of Resident Evil. There's so much for people. It's not Metal Gear Solid where you have Solid Snake, right, and maybe Raiden. Right, if you're lucky.
Maybe, right.
We've got the Barry stands, we've got the Ada fans, we've got all the different characters.
And then with Revelation 2, it threw that out the water, because now you got Barry returning, and then you got Claire returning, and it's the community is when it comes to fan stands, it's crazy with this community, which I also love it though. I love it. I would miss it if it was gone.
I'm just glad they fixed his face.
Right.
Like, I really hated that. I really hated that about Resident Evil 7.
That's my Redfield right there.
That was a huge mistake. And I think, it's like, surprise, this character is actually coming back. And we hinted at it at the radio broadcast before the end of the game. And different voice actor who sounds nothing like the Chris that we know, and completely different face. And, it was like unintentional misfire, right? Like I think they wanted people to spend the next few months wondering why Chris was doing what he was doing. But then people were just so fixated on whether it was him in the first place that I think a lot of the element of surprise got diverted into something that ended up being a huge nothing burger, right?
Right, exactly. Especially when
it's
when you go into the story and he's like, "Oh, I'm working with Umbrella now."
Okay.
you get a different face, you get a different voice actor, which I know it's probably nothing to do with the story, but now you're working with Umbrella. Who are you? You're not my Redfield. I don't know who you
Right.
are. You know, it
Like,
completely went left field.
like if you play the game with Japanese voicing, um, then that radio broadcast before the end, you can recognize that it's a voice because they've kept the same voice actor.
Okay.
So Japanese people who played it in Japanese and who know the language, obviously, it's like, oh, that voice, I know that voice, right? I think that's one of the lines in one of the Resident Evil games. That lead up made sense, even if the face was different. Like, but in the English version, it's just like, oh my god, like, who is this guy? So I'm glad they have the face that we know. He's back.
Was it like they couldn't find the correct face model? Was he not available for 7?
I think Capcom just didn't realize how important this was.
Right.
And I do respect the fact that maybe RE7's Chris does look broadly similar to the earlier renditions of Chris, but everything else was also different, right? The characterization and I just think they if they wanted Not a Hero to be the continuity to previous Resident Evil games, I think they really failed in that regard. So it's good to see Chris now in RE.
Yeah, someone over there at Capcom has some big plans for Chris for some reason. He's in quite a few of these Resident Evil titles, more than the fan favorites,
And we've spoke about his appearance. We spoke about his
Hmm.
appearance, and obviously watching the trailer, it seems like we're hinting towards a more evil Chris Redfield, which was first reference, I believe, in the original E3 trailer for Resident Evil Revelations, where they were going to kind of make Chris a little bit darker. What are your thoughts on that, Alex?
That's a good question. I think there's definitely a lot of misfire that they're intending to do. Like after the whole Jill thing in RE5, like nothing's off the table for me. Like in terms of how much they're willing to try to trick people. I just think we've forgotten about it in the last few years because we've gotten to where RE2 and RE3, right? And we know the stories to that. So there was very little surprise for those. RE7, they I guess the whole trick was it's not actually a reboot. It's still connected. But literally we're just not going to talk about anything else, right? Until the very end. So I'm waiting to see what the jig is like, and whether the jig is up or not with Chris. He has appeared in a lot of games recently, but it's kind of the quantity versus quality argument, right? Like I would not equate Chris's appearance in RE7 with his appearance in RE6 or RE5 or Code Veronica. I just think that kind of does a disservice to the character, right? I don't think 7 really represents Chris. I think he makes a guest appearance for a very short scenario, and he doesn't do very much. And the DLC isn't even on the disc, right? Like, it's the free DLC. So whereas the other DLC, End of Zoe, was on the disc for the gold edition. So that's why I don't really want to count RE7 as a full-on Chris game. With Village, who knows? We'll see how much of a role he plays. But if it's another short situation like with Revelations or with RE7, I'm going to be a little underwhelmed by that, right?
Are you broadly looking forward to it though? Resident Evil Village?
Oh, absolutely. I think it looks great. I think RE7 was another one of my favorite Resident Evil games, and I think it did so much right to bring back Resident Evil from the difficult situation it was in, thanks to RE6. And I think it would have been underwhelming to get another over-the-shoulder Resident Evil game this soon. So I'm really glad that they're going back to the first person, and hopefully the next-gen consoles allow for a lot of technological improvements that weren't possible this generation, especially with loading times. I think the size of the world have potential to improve, hopefully. Assuming this is a full-fledged next-gen game. Like, I don't know. The visuals don't look far enough advanced over RE7 that I would wonder if maybe they have plans for a PS4 and an Xbox One version. I don't know, but
well, we do know that the play test was undertaken on a PlayStation 4 Pro. That we do know.
Oh, okay.
So,
Right.
but they
Sure.
haven't confirmed that it's going to be on PS4 Pro. All we know that it was the only official information we know is that it's going to be a PS5 release. But I don't think that rules out a PS4 release, and I think it'd be silly if they didn't put it on PS4 in some aspect.
Yeah, I mean, if those systems can run the game, I would definitely encourage Capcom to put it on there, because I think from what we hear, the next gen consoles are going to be expensive, right?
Right, right.
And we're in the middle of a very terrible recession, so I wouldn't think it's right to. I wouldn't think the optics are good for forcing people to buy next gen consoles when you don't have to, right? So
right.
Yeah, I think, but yeah, I mean, either way, I think the game looks great, and I can't wait to see what kind of twists that they're gonna throw at us. I mean, I did say earlier that I'm waiting to see what the twist is, but I'm still pretty excited. I think it's.
What's your prediction?
If those rumors are true, I think this could be the game where they finally get rid of Chris. I don't know. I just feel like it's time.
No.
Well, they did reference that. They did reference that at the start. It said his story is coming to end. We don't know if that's Ethan's story. We don't know if it's Chris's story. That's the twist. That's the dangling the carrot that they're doing to us.
I'm so scared.
That's the fascinating part, because if you follow the coverage in Japanese, so a few weeks ago I tweeted about the interview that Capcom's producers had with Famitsu, and the trailer. When that man's story comes to an end, appears with Japanese subtitles, they use, if I translate it into English directly, like this guy or this man's story, right? And they use that same verbiage to refer to Ethan in that interview.
Right.
So if I only knew Japanese and I didn't know English, I would have assumed that man is Ethan.
Right?
Understood.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it could just be an unintentional
translation
thing. Like maybe they're just sticking to the easiest vocabulary they can come up with. Well, it's not a translation thing, because it's the same word in Japanese, so that's why as far as Village is concerned, that man has been referred to as Ethan in the Famitsu coverage, but it could still mean Chris. Who knows, right?
A lot of stuff is still up in the air.
I don't think Ethan has much of a future after this game, because I think that would be pushing it as far as their whole insistence of not showing his face is concerned, right? I think I don't think I can deal with another Resident Evil game with a faceless protagonist.
Right.
So I do think this is. Oh, but they have been very forthcoming with the fact that this is the conclusion to the story that began in RE7. So
right.
I do imagine Ethan's story does come to an end, or at least it wraps up.
Right,
and there will be very little ambiguity after that. How that relates to Chris or not, I mean, we don't know, right? He could get killed, he could retire, it could all be smoke and mirrors. Yeah, it's hard to say.
There's a rumor flying around that another returning RE character is in the midst of this, and we just it makes me think so much more, and it also makes me think, like, what has happened in between the events of 7 and now, that we don't know that they're going to explain in 8.
That's a good question. We didn't get a Revelations 3 or anything like that, or another movie, right, to contextualize what happened between
we do know
7 and 8.
We do know Ethan is the only person ever to have had confirmed sex in a Resident Evil game. He now has a child in Resident Evil 8.
Well, Barry and Wesker.
Barry and Wesker.
Actually, oh yeah, they got kids. Yeah.
Wesker Jake could very much be a test tube baby, for all we know.
Yeah, we don't know. But actually, Barry's daughter Maura is pre-confirmed.
Like, Chris is in his 40s. I can't imagine he's a virgin.
Well, I don't know. With all those steroids, he could have gone real sterile real quick.
I mean, they're all pretty attractive people.
Maybe that's the subplot to Resident Evil 8 is Chris is killing Mia because they've actually had had coitus, had sex. So therefore, that's not allowed in Resident Evil. So
he had to put her out. He had to put her down.
Yeah. He did.
Well, see, my gripe with Ethan as like that makes me go back to what you said. Like they're all pretty attractive characters. My gripe with Ethan is that he is like a potato.
Yeah, he's just the average.
Yeah.
The everyday
He's bland.
guy,
Whereas Chris and Jill and Leon and Claire, they all have this depth and there's really good characters. And Capcom has always been really good about their characters.
It's like they never played Silent Hill game in terms of trying to figure out how to have an ordinary person, be the main character, right?
Right.
It was actually, I mean, I don't dislike Ethan. I mean, I think the whole point is that literally he didn't want this, but it came to him.
Right. Right.
And so I think they sold that really well, but a lot of his reactions are definitely a little unnatural in terms of like, there is a person with a chainsaw chasing you. You're not screaming or panicking or breathing deeply. You're just right. Like if I came at you with a chainsaw, you'd be a little frightened, right?
Right, and he's not even questioning like as to why his wife is here or anything like in the dialogue in between the scuffle between them two. He's just like, "What have you become?" Not like, "What's going on here? Why are you like this?" Ethan, you're not asking the hard-hitting questions, my friend.
sees a cop and he's like, "You gotta give me a gun."
You gotta give me your gun.
What? No.
and he's not giving any context to the cop either,
Yeah, the deputy. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just like. Yeah, Resident Evil, even though it's getting more and more realistic, there are situations where you really do have to turn your brain off, unfortunately. And
Agreed.
I don't mean that in a good way. I mean, sometimes if you want your escapism, then yeah, that's fine. But RE7 was definitely kind of a funny game in that regard.
Yeah. But it's really cool as an OG veteran fan. It brought me back. It brought me back real hard. I thought I wasn't gonna like it. I loved it. Loved it.
Yeah.
Didn't have zombies. Cool.
No.
Needed 5 or 6.
Yeah, the game is almost 4 years old. It's 3.5 years old now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, time flies. I think if we're to compare this generation to the first one, RE7 would have been the RE1 like game, and RE2 remake would have been the RE2 of the gen. RE3 remake would have been the RE3 of the gen. So we'll see if Village turns out to be like RE4 Code Veronica or both. Right?
I do feel like it's starting to, like, if you look back at Resident Evil 2 remake, it definitely borrowed a few elements from 1.5, even having what's her name? I can't remember her name. The secondary character from 1.5. Her name is escaping me now, and I'm killing myself for it. The Elsa Walker, thank you. Elsa Walker. So it even had the skin in RE2. It did, for me, it borrowed a couple more elements from 1.5, and I feel like almost Resident Evil 8 is doing that with Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 3.5. The beta to that, I feel like it's borrowing a few elements from that. The whole hallucination, the almost supernatural element to Resident Evil 8 that I'm getting, the vibe I'm getting.
Yeah. I would say that. I mean, I would imagine the original concept for Resident Evil 4, the 3.5 hallucination idea. I mean, I would say it's been possible technologically for a long time now.
There's got to be a build somewhere.
But I would say that, with the upcoming next gen consoles and their SSDs, right, that allow for very minimal load times, like we saw with the Ratchet and Clank demo on the PS5 trailer, you can instantly change worlds, right, with the press of a button in real time. And I think that is a very advanced version of what they were trying to do back in the day. So if Resident Evil Village takes advantage of the next gen hardware, uses their loading times to uses their SSDs to reduce loading times, and get some very interesting hallucination effects in there, then I think it would be really interesting, because up until now, whenever worlds shift, those are masked loading times, right? Like in RE5, sometimes when the videotapes start, you have to load the entire thing and it takes like a minute. Or like in Silent Hill, when the worlds morph, it's part of a cutscene. Ideally, you can achieve those hallucination effects without the bottleneck of loading times, right? So it'll be interesting to see where they go with that, where they go with that idea.
In most recent Resident Evil games, it has been apparent that they're really good at hiding loading times now. Super like pros even, I would say. Like if you play Resident Evil 7 now, I don't think I can even. The only loading.
Aside from the start, when you actually load into the game, I
and when you respawn from a death, is the only ones I can think of.
Yeah. Do you remember in Revelations the rotating doors?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, those are really distracting.
Yeah.
Luckily, RE Engine was made to get rid of that issue. So we should see a much better version of it next gen.
What is your opinion going back into what, this is going to be like the first gen Resident Evil 1 run for 7 and then 2 remake and 3 remake. What is your opinion on the next remake in line for Resident Evil remakes, it being 4, whereas fans have an outcry for Code Veronica?
Yeah, I think skipping Code Veronica in general is not a great idea because one, I think Resident Evil 4 needs a remake less than Code Veronica does.
I agree.
And I'm not sure what we can, at least not having seen the remake of 4, I'm just not sure what we can gain out of a remake like that. Capcom, every action-oriented Resident Evil game Capcom made after RE4, including 5 and the Revelations games and 6, Operation Raccoon City, if you want to count that as well, Umbrella Corps, RE3 remake, even, like, they've all been nowhere near as good as RE4.
Right.
And I don't think it's because they have to come up with their own set pieces. I just think it's hard to replicate a game like RE4 to the same degree. So the fact that they're going to try to remake it, or they're rumored to try to remake it, it makes me worry, because I just don't think that it's just unlikely to be as good as the original.
Do you think timing had something to do with it? The timing it was released?
I believe so. You mean the original game or
yes,
upcoming
4, original 4?
I would say that Resident Evil 4 Remake is a convenient game to move on to after RE3 because it's different from Village, it's different from RE2, it's different from RE7, and even RE3 in the sense that it's all action, right? And it's a very long game. So I do think it's Capcom trying to make that third, as I mentioned earlier, that third Resident Evil style, right? Mm-hmm. If they do Code Veronica right now, they'd have to go back to the horror focus, but that's been well covered in the last few years. So I think it makes sense for them to park the horror focus for a few years. Village is still coming out, so it's not like they're parking it entirely, but do Village and then get RE4 out, do the action on there. And then, in a few years when all these Resident Evil games have come out and they want to revisit the horror focus again in third person, I do think that would be the time to go and make Code Veronica.
So you don't think now's the time, even fresh off the heels of Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake, because especially since that a lot of fans of the game have never actually experienced Code Veronica because they didn't know it was a mainline game. And whereas like if they remade it with the same RE engine and photorealistic style of Resident Evil 2 remake and the same thought as Resident Evil 2 remake as it is now, I think it would sell exponentially, especially considering a lot of the fan base has not even experienced this story, and now they'll experience it in this new engine and this new style with a whole new feeling. I agree. I do think a remake of Veronica is absolutely necessary. I do think it would do very well. And I would love to see it, especially me, because Code Veronica was my first Resident Evil game, and even though it's not my absolute favorite, it's probably the one that just kind of gives me certain feels, right? I assume that's got to be why your name is CVX Freak, right?
Exactly.
Hey, right. Okay.
I recently played Code Veronica on the Switch. I ended up installing Homebrew on the thing, and
did you? Did you really?
Yeah. Because Capcom won't do it themselves, so I did it myself, right?
That's awesome. That's awesome.
But again, like if Resident Evil 2 is still a recent memory, so is Resident Evil 7. Village is very horror focused. So if they're going to release a fourth horror oriented Resident Evil game in as many years, I guess it's 2022, they'd release a next remake. I just think it would be too much of one style of Resident Evil and not enough of another. right? So, I mean, I think that if Code Veronica, if they waited a few years, they won't burn out the horror Resident Evil too soon, right? So I think it's a strategic
Okay, I could see that actually.
choice.
I could see that because like you got 2 remake, which is obviously pure, like it went off with the horror, that's what we wanted. Then you got RA3 remake, but which it wasn't really, it was more action oriented. You could obviously tell. Plus, and then they released Resistance, which is completely just an online game. And now we got Village, but do you think Village is going to be more action based then?
I would guess it's probably going to be along the same lines as RE2. I don't think we'll end up with an enemy that's like Nemesis that has a rocket launcher or a thrower. I don't think we'll get anything like that. I think it'll probably be on par with RE2 in terms of the intensity of the action. Maybe even less, right?
Right. So, yeah. Depending, and especially with so much information still up in the air, we really don't know what kind of game this is going to be.
Yeah, I don't think the enemies in that game will have guns in their hands.
Right, but I mean, I forget who was telling me. I think it was Andy here. He was telling me that Capcom has a bad habit of throwing out already set games and completely just rehauling it.
Yeah, they're not afraid to do that. Definitely.
Yeah, they'll rehaul some if they wake up one day and they're like, yeah, no, they'll completely rehaul it. I mean, what was it? The trailer he was showing me the other day of Resident Evil Revelations launch trailer was not the game that we saw that we came out in 3DS at all.
Nope. Nope. Not at all. Right. That was just that was filler to fill the lineup of the 3DS announcement back in the day, 10 years ago, actually.
So, yeah.
So as we start to wind this podcast out, I'm very grateful you stayed on for 3 hours. There's so much knowledge here. It'd just be rude not to.
It's great.
I really appreciate it. I really, honestly, goes without saying. Really
bad for you, Andy, because it's the middle of the night so I apologize for keeping it so long.
No problem at all. So where can we find you on social media, Alex?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram under the same username. So okay. I'm very happy to if people want to read what I tweet, and if people need to reach out to me, they can just send a tweet to me directly.
Oh, awesome! And Instagram as well.
Exactly. Yes, okay, that's correct. I do have a website. I hardly ever update it, so I wouldn't go there if you don't have to. Yeah, those would be the 2 main ones for sure. And I do have a Discord account. I have no idea what the name is, but if people need to reach out to me for that, I guess they can do that as well.
Awesome. So what I'd like to do just before we wrap here is I'm going to put up your Unbound page here, and I've linked it for the live viewers, and I'm going to link it for the podcast when we upload it on demand. But give me an elevator pitch. What are you doing with Itchy Tasty, the unofficial history of Resident Evil, as a recap to this podcast?
So my book chronicles the first 10 or 2 years of Resident Evil development history. I speak directly with the developers, and I asked up their intentions about how they created Resident Evil games, why they made them, what challenges they face, how things changed over time, and how they look back at their ups and downs and their successes and failures. A lot of the information in the book is brand new and hasn't been real divulged in public until this podcast. Rather, I did speak a lot about what's in the book on this podcast today, which I was very happy to do. But I do think it's one thing to read the whole thing, and
of course,
and another to read to hear about it, right? So I think it'll be very exciting, and I hope that people really enjoy it, because I think it'll have a lot of nice sizes for people.
As diehard Resident Evil fans, it'd be really, we'd be remiss not to, look into something like this. I can bet you that I'll have a copy on my desk.
Oh no, it goes without saying. Just to recap, the an estimated delivery date, because at the moment it's currently being crowdfunded. But when are you anticipating that this is gonna hit people?
Well, this is a bit different from Kickstarter in that there's no publicized end date to the funding. The end date will be whenever we're ready to move on to manufacture the first edition, and then we're going to cap it based on the number of pledges gotten. The book will be available for general release after, so you'll be able to buy it on Amazon, and there'll be an ebook as well and an audio book after that. But the book is done. I finished my part. The edits are done. I do think I have one more edit that I'm waiting for from the publisher that will have like all the various visual designs integrated into it. But yeah, it should be out by April. It's actually really time consuming to write books, I found out, right? And get them checked. Like I just recently had a legal edit, and they had to make sure that there was nothing in the book that can be considered as defamation or libel, right?
That makes sense.
So there's an intricate process involved with a lot of people who are experts in their field, right? And this was my first time writing a book. I'm not an actual author anymore, so there are a lot of challenges, but I'm glad that the people that I worked with, and plus the support of fans like you two and Resident Evil community as a whole, they've been their interest in the project from the very beginning, and their eagerness to pay for this book ahead of time without having seen anything. It's really something I'm very grateful for, and I don't think this project would have happened without the support community. So thank you, and I apologize for the short delay, but I hope it'll be worth it when it comes out.
Oh man, we're happy to have that you're providing it. Trust me, the community is very happy.
Yeah, no, this is
this is gold right here.
Okay. Well, I thank you for your time, Alex, and thank you to everybody that's listened. Thank you to everybody that's listened so far.
This was fun to do, and thanks to the listeners.
Yeah, and we'd totally love to have you on in future, and we can dive in, we can proper deep dive into some of the Resident Evils. But I've been Andy from Biohazard Declassified. This is the Biohazard Declassified podcast. Have a safe day, have a safe night, and I'm sure we'll catch you all in the next one.